Hey, welcome back everyone. Or if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found your way to this corner of the internet. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most people never get to go. Not a battlefield, not a throne room filled with gold and ceremony. I want to take you behind all of that, behind the velvet curtains, past the guards in their polished armor, through the gilded doors that almost no one was allowed to open. I want to take you inside a royal court. And here's the thing I need you to sit with for just a second before we begin. What if the most powerful people in the world were also in a very real way the least free? What if the king who could order a man's head removed by breakfast was himself a prisoner watched, managed, performed, and controlled every single minute of every single day? That is not a metaphor. That is history. And it is far stranger, far more fascinating, and honestly far more heartbreaking than anything you learned in school. So get comfortable. We're going in. Let's start with the image most of us carry in our heads when we think of a royal court. You probably picture Versailles, and honestly, who can blame you? The place was designed specifically so that you could not stop picturing it. That was the entire point. When Louis XIV began transforming his father's old hunting lodge into the Palace of Versailles in the 1660s, he was not just building a house, he was building an argument, a statement written in marble and mirror glass, and 20,000 acres of manicured garden that said without a single word, "There is no power in this world greater than mine." By the time the palace was completed, a project that took decades and reportedly drained somewhere between 1% and 3% of France's entire annual income for years, it housed somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people at any given time. Noble servants, soldiers, courtiers, clergy, entertainers, ambassadors, a whole city pressed under one enormous roof. And at the center of it all, like the sun around which every planet orbited the king. Now, here is where I think we need to slow down, because this is where the story gets genuinely strange. We look at those portraits of Louis XIV, the long curled wig, the red heels, the posture of a man who has never once in his life been told to sit down. And we think that man had everything. And in one sense, yes, absolutely. He had more wealth, more authority, more raw power than almost any human being who had ever lived. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you woke up in the morning, walked to your own bathroom, and just brushed your teeth alone? Without anyone watching, Louis XIV could not do that. Not because he was incapable, but because the entire structure of the French royal court had been deliberately designed so that the king was never ever alone. Not in the morning, not at meals, not in the evening, not even in the most private, intimate moments of his personal life. Every single action the king performed, waking up, getting dressed, eating breakfast, praying, going to bed, was a formal ceremony with designated attendees, prescribed rituals, and an audience that could number in the dozens. Historians call the morning ceremony the lever from the French word for rising. It began before dawn. A first gentleman of the bedchamber would enter, pull back the curtain on the royal bed, and announce that it was time to wake. Then, in a carefully choreographed sequence, various nobles would enter in order of rank. One man had the privilege of handing the king his shirt. Another was permitted to hold the candle holder. Someone else brought the water basin. Each of these roles, and I want to be clear, I'm not exaggerating here, each of these roles was considered an enormous honor that noblemen would actively compete and scheme to obtain. Think about that. Some of the most powerful aristocrats in France were thrilled, genuinely thrilled to hand a man his trousers. Why? Why would anyone want that? Because proximity to power is power. That's a rule that has held true from the pharaohs of ancient Egypt to the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. And it held true in the gilded corridors of Versailles with brutal precision. If you were in that room when the king woke up, you could lean over and whisper something in his ear. You could plant an idea, request a favor, warn about arrival. You had access, and in a royal court, access was everything. This is the part that I find genuinely fascinating about royal courts, and I think it gets overlooked in most history books, because it is harder to photograph than a chandelier. The royal court was not just a building. It was a system, a carefully constructed machine for managing power. And one of its most clever features was this: by turning every aspect of the king's daily life into a public ceremony, the court made sure that the king himself was as visible, as monitored, and in many ways as controlled as anyone else inside those walls. Consider the logic. If the king eats alone in private, who knows what he's doing? Who knows who he's meeting with? What he's planning? What mood he's in? But if the king eats in public, which Louis XIV frequently did seated at a table, while courtiers stood and watched him consume his dinner in near total silence, then everyone knows the court becomes a theater and the king is simultaneously the director and the star performer. He cannot afford a bad performance. He cannot have an off day. Every gesture, every expression, every word he speaks or does not speak will be analyzed, discussed, and reinterpreted by hundreds of people before the sun goes down. The philosopher Michel Foucault once argued that surveillance is itself a form of control, that being watched changes how a person behaves. He was writing about prisons, but he could just as easily have been writing about Versailles. The king was always being watched. That watching shaped his behavior, and that shaping over time became the invisible architecture of royal power. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that life inside a royal court was just theater and protocol and carefully folded napkins, because it was also genuinely, viscerally dangerous. The closer you were to the king, the more everyone else wanted to take your place. And people in royal courts had an impressive variety of tools at their disposal for doing exactly that. Gossip was a weapon. Rumor was a siege engine. A well-placed whisper in the right ear could end a career, a marriage, or a life. Louis XIV reportedly had a network of informants inside the palace itself. Servants who reported conversations they had overheard ladies-in-waiting, who kept track of which noble had spent too long talking to which foreign ambassador. The palace was beautiful. It was also a surveillance state with better furniture. There is a story, and historians debate exactly how much of it is true versus embellished by later writers, about a noble woman in the French court who spent 3 years carefully cultivating a friendship with a rival, only to use a single perfectly timed revelation about that rival's private correspondence to have her permanently exiled from court. 3 years for one move. That is chess played with human beings as the pieces. And this was not unique to France. The Ottoman court in Constantinople, the Renaissance, the Forbidden City in Beijing, the Elizabethan court in London, the Medici court in Florence. Every great royal court in history operated on some version of the same principle. The court was a controlled environment where power was distributed not through brute force, but through access, performance, and information. Whoever controlled the information controlled the court. Whoever controlled the court, in many ways, controlled the king. Here is the thing I keep coming back to the more I've read about these places. We look at history and we see kings and queens as the agents of their time, the people who made decisions, who shaped the world. And they were, to a real degree, but they were also the products of their courts, shaped by the systems that surrounded them, influenced by the people who had earned the right to be near them, limited by the rituals and expectations that came with the crown. Henry VIII of England was one of the most forceful personalities in European history, a man who dissolved monasteries, created a new church, and married 6 women with varying degrees of enthusiasm. And yet, even Henry could not escape the logic of the court. His advisors, his favorites, his wives, they all operated within that same system, pulling levers and managing access and whispering at the right moments. Thomas Cromwell did not serve Henry through loyalty alone. He served through being indispensable. The moment he stopped being indispensable, he lost his head. The court giveth and the court taketh away. And that, I think, is the most honest summary of what it meant to live inside one of these places. You were never really safe. You were never really free. And yet, people sacrificed enormous amounts. Money, family, health, integrity, just for the chance to be inside those walls. Because inside the gilded cage, at least you were close to the thing that mattered most: power. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting, and I promise we are just getting started. Because everything we've talked about so far has been about the surface, the ceremonies, the watching, the politics of proximity. But what about the actual physical space of these courts? What about the way the buildings themselves were designed to make certain people feel powerful and others feel small? What about the fact that the architecture of a palace, the height of a ceiling, the length of a corridor, the placement of a throne was itself a political statement calculated down to the inch? That is exactly what we're going to explore next. Because when you understand how these spaces were built and why they were built that way, the whole story of royal power looks completely different. Stay with me. So, we just talked about the invisible system, the ceremonies, the watching, the politics of who stood closest to the king. But here is something I want you to think about for a moment. All of that, every whisper, every power struggle, every carefully timed bow happened inside a building. And that building was not accidental. It was not just a large, expensive house that happened to be beautiful. It was engineered. Every corridor, every doorway, every ceiling height, every single window was placed with deliberate intention to communicate one thing above all others: who matters here and who does not. And once you see it, once you understand that a palace is not just architecture, but a physical argument written in stone, you will never look at a grand building the same way again. Let us start with something that sounds almost too simple to be interesting. Doors, specifically, who gets to open them, who has to knock, and how long they have to wait. In the Palace of Versailles, the king's private apartments were arranged in a series of rooms, each one progressively more restricted than the last. The further into the sequence you could travel without being stopped, the closer you were to the center of power. Most people never made it past the first or second room. A select few could enter the third or fourth, and the innermost rooms, the actual bedchamber, the private study, those were reserved for a handful of people in the entire kingdom. Historians sometimes call this a graduated access system, and it sounds very dry and academic when you put it that way. But think about what it actually felt like to live inside it. Imagine you are a duke. You have land-wealth soldiers, a name that goes back 400 years. You ride up to Versailles, dismount in the courtyard, and then you wait. Because there are rooms you cannot enter, doors that will not open for you. And somewhere beyond those doors, men with less distinguished bloodlines than yours are standing next to the king, whispering in his ear, shaping policy that affects your entire estate. That slow burn of exclusion, that was not an accident. That was architecture doing exactly what it was designed to do. The Forbidden City in Beijing operates on almost the identical principle, and it predates Versailles by about 2 centuries, built during the early Ming Dynasty, beginning around 1406. The Forbidden City is not one building, but a sequence of nested enclosures, 24 concentric layers of walls, gates, and courtyards, each one requiring higher authority to enter than the last. The name itself tells you everything. Forbidden. The city where most of the empire's subjects could not set foot on pain of death. At its center sat the emperor in the Hall of Supreme Harmony on the Dragon Throne, and the physical distance between an ordinary citizen and that throne, measured not just in meters, but in gates past guards, cleared permissions granted, was itself the embodiment of imperial authority. The emperor did not need to announce that he was powerful. The building announced it for him continuously to every single person who approached. Now, here is where it gets genuinely fascinating, and I think this is the part that most people miss entirely. The architecture of power was not just about excluding people from the center. It was also about controlling how people moved through space, and crucially, how that movement made them feel. Let me give you a very specific example. When an ambassador arrived at Versailles to present credentials to Louis XIV, they did not simply walk in through the front door and shake hands. They were led through a deliberate sequence of spaces, each one larger, more ornate, and more overwhelming than the last. First, the outer courtyard's grand but functional. Then the entrance hall, already impressive. Then up the grand staircase, the ambassador's staircase, which was eventually demolished in 1752, a structure of colored marble with painted ceilings that depicted the 4 continents, paying tribute to France. By the time a foreign dignitary reached that staircase, they had already been psychologically prepared for what was coming. Then, the Hall of Mirrors, 73 yards long, 17 arched mirrors facing 17 arched windows overlooking the gardens, 257 mirrored panels, 20,000 candles on chandeliers that could be lowered, lit, and raised so that the entire hall blazed in the middle of the night. The ceiling painted with scenes of French military victories, specifically victories over the Holy Roman Empire and the Dutch Republic, just in case any ambassadors from those regions needed a reminder of where they stood. By the time a foreign visitor stood in that room, they had been marinated in French imperial glory for 20 solid minutes. They had not yet seen the king. They were already overwhelmed, and that was the point. You walk into a negotiation feeling small, and you will negotiate small. Does that principle sound familiar? It should, because it did not die with a monarchy. Every modern corporate headquarters, every presidential palace, every government building that uses soaring ceilings and vast empty lobbies is drawing on the exact same playbook. The architecture of power has simply changed its clothes. But let us stay in the past a little longer, because I want to tell you about a building that I think is the most psychologically sophisticated royal space ever constructed. And it is one that most people have never heard of. The Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, was the administrative and residential heart of the Ottoman Empire for nearly 4 centuries, from the 1480s until the 1850s. And unlike Versailles, which was designed to be seen and admired from the outside, Topkapi was designed to be almost invisible. From the outside, it looked like a modest complex of low buildings surrounded by walls. No grand facade, no towering columns, nothing to suggest that inside those walls, one of the most powerful rulers on earth was making decisions that shaped the lives of 20 million people. And that modesty was entirely intentional, because inside the palace was not one building, but a labyrinth. A deliberately confusing maze of courtyards, pavilions, gardens, and corridors that even longtime residents sometimes struggle to navigate. There were 4 main courtyards, each with a distinct function and a distinct set of rules about who could enter and what they could wear while doing so. The innermost courtyard, the privy garden, the harem, was so restricted that even high-ranking officials of the empire might spend their entire careers without ever seeing it. Here is something that I find almost poetic about Topkap. The deliberate confusion of the layout was itself a security feature. If you did not know the palace, you could not find the Sultan quickly enough to reach him in an emergency, or more importantly, in a coup attempt. The architecture was not just communication, it was defense. The building protected the ruler by making him physically hard to locate. That is a level of political thinking embedded into bricks and mortar that I find genuinely remarkable. One more building deserves mention here, and I am picking it deliberately because it represents a completely different philosophy of royal power. The Alhambra in Granada, Spain, built by the Nasrid dynasty of the Moorish kingdom. primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, where Versailles overwhelmed you with scale and gold, and the Forbidden City overpowered you with distance and prohibition. The Alhambra seduced you. Its rooms are intimate. Its courtyards are built around the sound of the water fountain's channels. The perpetual soft rush of the Darro River diverted through the complex. Its walls are covered not in triumphant painted ceilings, but in geometric tilework and carved plaster so intricate that scholars have spent careers cataloging it. And the geometry has been found to anticipate mathematical concepts that would not be formally described in the West for another 3 centuries. The message of the Alhambra is not, "I am more powerful than you." The message is, "I am more refined than you. I exist at a higher level of civilization than you can fully comprehend." And somehow, that works just as effectively. When Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile conquered Granada in 1492 and moved into the Alhambra, they were so overwhelmed by it that they left most of it intact. They built a new palace beside it, a heavy Renaissance structure that sits next to the Noose Reed rooms, like a blunt instrument next to a piece of lace. Many historians read that Jouy position as a kind of inadvertent confession. The conquerors could not match what they had conquered, so they built beside it and hoped no one would notice. Here is what I keep thinking about reflecting on all of this. We often talk about power as though it is a thing held by people, by rulers, by generals, by wealthy families. And yes, of course it is. But what the great royal courts understood far better than we usually give them credit for is that power is also spatial. It lives in the places where decisions are made. It is shaped by the environments that surround those decisions. A king who meets you in a small room is having a conversation. A king who makes you cross 4 courtyards, climb a ceremonial staircase, walk through a hall of gilded mirrors, and then stand at a respectful distance while he sits elevated on a canopied throne. The king has already won the meeting before he opens his mouth. The architecture was not decoration. It was argument. It was persuasion. It was, in the most literal sense of the word, power made visible. And that power, as we're about to discover, extended right down to the most mundane and most intimate aspects of daily life inside these courts. Because once you understood how the building controlled you, the next question is, what happened to the people living inside it? What did they actually eat? How did they sleep? And was the food prepared at enormous expense, served with elaborate ritual laid out on tables that groaned under the weight of gold and silver? Was it actually safe to eat? That question has a far darker answer than most people expect. All right, close your eyes for a second and imagine this. It is 6 o'clock in the morning. You have not slept particularly well because, frankly, you never sleep particularly well. The weight of an empire has a way of following you into your dreams. Your bed is enormous, canopied, surrounded by heavy curtains. The room is dark and warm. And then a door opens. Not one person, not your spouse, not a close friend whispering, "Hey, time to get up." A procession. Men in formal court dress moving in a prescribed order. Each one assigned a specific role in what is about to happen. One carries a candle. One carries a basin of water. One holds the royal shirt, which has been warmed and prepared according to exact specifications. Another stands ready with the outer garments. Another with the shoes. The Grand Chamberlain oversees everything, making sure no step is skipped and no protocol is violated. You are the most powerful person in the known world, and you cannot even get dressed by yourself. Welcome to the morning ritual of the royal court. One of the most psychologically complex performances in the history of human civilization, and one that most people today would find genuinely astonishing if they saw it. We touched briefly on the lever of Louis XIV in our earlier conversation, just enough to understand that it existed. But I want to go deeper now because the details of this ritual are where the real story lives. And the real story is far more layered than most history textbooks bother to explain. Louis XIV did not invent the mourning ceremony. Royal households had maintained structured mourning rituals for centuries before him, across many cultures and many continents. But what Louis did, and this was a stroke of political genius that I genuinely believe does not get enough credit, was to transform a practical routine into the central organizing event of French political life. The lever was divided into several distinct stages, each one with a name, a sequence, and a list of who was permitted to be present. The first stage, called the petite entrée, admitted only the most intimate members of the household. The first valet, the chief physician, a handful of personal attendants. These were the people who saw the king at his most human, drowsy, unguarded, before the performance of royalty had fully begun. The trust required to be admitted at this stage was enormous, and the men who held these positions guarded them ferociously. The second stage, the grand entrée, admitted the senior officers of the household, the Grand Chamberlain, the first gentleman of the bedchamber, the captain of the guards. By now, the king was sitting up, his hair being attended to the broad choreography of dressing underway. Then came the entrée, admitting princes of the blood and senior courtiers. Then, the Grande Chambre, which opened to a wider circle of nobility. And finally, the king would process to the chapel for morning prayers publicly, visibly, with the entire court trailing in organized formation behind him. The whole sequence, from the first opening of the bedchamber door to the arrival at the chapel, took somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour and a half, depending on the day and the king's mood. Every single morning for decades. Now, here's the question I always find myself asking. Why would anyone, even a king, submit to this? Why would you want your most private, vulnerable moments of the day turned into a public spectacle? And the answer, I think, reveals something profound about the nature of power and the psychology of the people who hold it. Louis XIV grew up during a period of genuine political instability. As a child, he lived through a civil uprising known as the Fronde, a series of revolts by the French nobility and the courts of law that began in 1648, when Louis was just 10 years old and stretched for years afterward. At one point during the worst of it, a mob forced their way into the royal nursery in the middle of the night to verify that the young king was still there. Young Louis pretended to be asleep while strangers stood over his bed. Let that sink in for a moment. The most powerful child in France lay in the dark, keeping perfectly still while hostile strangers stared at him. That experience never left him, and I believe, though historians debate the degree that it shaped his obsession with visibility and control more than anything else in his life, because the Fronde taught him one lesson above all others. A king who is not seen is a king who can be doubted. A king who can be doubted is a king who can be challenged. And a king who can be challenged might one day find a mob standing over his bed. The solution: never be invisible. Make your presence the organizing principle of every single day. Turn your waking up, your dressing, your eating, your praying into events that require the attendance of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Because a duke who is standing in your bedroom at 6 o'clock in the morning watching you put on your shoes is a duke who is not in the countryside raising an army. The morning ritual was not vanity, it was a leash, but France was not alone in this. And I want to make sure we do not fall into the trap of thinking that elaborate royal mourning ceremonies were a peculiarly French eccentricity. The imperial court of Japan developed what may be the most intricate and spiritually loaded royal mourning ritual in human history, and it operated on entirely different principles from the French model, which makes the comparison fascinating. In the Japanese imperial tradition, the emperor was not merely a political figure. He was, in the Shinto understanding of the world, a divine being, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This meant that his daily rituals were not just courtly performance, they were religious acts. The ceremonies surrounding the emperor's waking, washing, dressing, and eating were conducted with the solemnity and precision of sacred rites, because in a very real cultural sense, they were sacred rites. The emperor's body was considered so spiritually potent that it needed constant ritual maintenance to keep the connection between the human and divine realms in proper alignment. His hair could only be cut at prescribed times. The direction he faced during certain ceremonies was determined by cosmological calculations. The water used for his morning ablutions was drawn from specific sources according to exact protocols. And here is the remarkable thing. Unlike Louis XIV, who used his morning ritual to project power outward to make other people feel small, the Japanese imperial ritual was largely internal. It was about the emperor maintaining his own spiritual integrity, not about performing dominance over the court. Two completely different cultures, two completely different understandings of what a king is and what he is for. And yet both arrived at the same conclusion. The morning routine of a ruler is too important to be left to the ruler himself. There is one more morning ritual tradition I want to bring in here because I think it adds a dimension that neither France nor Japan quite captures. The Ottoman Sultan's morning in the Topkapi Palace, the same palace we visited architecturally in our last chapter, was organized according to a principle that blended the political theater of Versailles with something closer to military discipline. The Sultan rose early, his personal attendants. The inner pages, young men from elite families who had been selected and trained specifically for palace service, would assist with dressing in near silence. The ceremony was precise and orderly, but it was not a spectacle open to courtiers in the way the lever was. The Ottoman inner chamber was genuinely private in a way that the French court never was. What happened after the morning preparations, though, was entirely public and entirely political. The Sultan would take his seat in the Deen, the imperial council chamber, and the machinery of empire would begin its daily rotation. Ministers would present cases, ambassadors would await audiences, petitions would be reviewed. The Sultan might or might not be visibly present in the chamber at certain periods of Ottoman history. The Sultan watched proceedings through a screened window, invisible to the council below, but able to observe everything. Visible to some, invisible to others. Accessible and inaccessible simultaneously. It is a more subtle form of power than Louis XIV's theatrical self-display, and in some ways I find it more unsettling, because at least with Louis, you knew where you stood. With the Ottoman arrangement, you were never entirely sure whether you were being watched or not, which, now that I think about it, might have been considerably more effective. What I keep returning to across all of these very different traditions is the same underlying truth. The morning ritual was never really about the morning. It was about ownership, about who owned the first moments of the most powerful person's day, and therefore, in some meaningful sense, who shaped the entire day that followed. The people who dressed the king, who handed him his first cup of water, who spoke the first words he heard after waking those people, had access to something more valuable than money or land or military rank. They had access to the unguarded mind, the mind before it had fully assembled its defenses, and everyone in the court knew it, which is why those positions were fought over, schemed for, and clung to with a desperation that might strike us as absurd today. But it was not absurd. It was entirely rational. Information flows upward in a hierarchy, and the information that flows from the king, his moods, his preoccupations, the things he mumbled about while still half asleep, flowed from his bedroom first. Be in that room, and you were in a very real sense holding the pulse of the kingdom in your hands. Now, if the morning ritual tells us something about the politics of access and the theater of power, the next chapter of palace life takes us somewhere even more intimate and considerably more dangerous. Because once the king was dressed and the morning ceremonies were concluded, there was still the matter of breakfast and lunch and dinner. The royal table, it turns out, was not simply a place to eat. It was one of the most fraught, most politically charged, and as we're about to discover, most genuinely perilous environments in the entire palace. Because the food that appeared on that table could heal an alliance seal, a treaty, demonstrate the wealth of a dynasty, or end a life. And the systems that royal courts developed to make sure the second of those outcomes did not happen are some of the most elaborate, most paranoid, and most quietly fascinating chapters in the entire story of royal power. Let us go to the table. Picture the most elaborate dinner party you have ever attended. Maybe there were candles on the table. Maybe someone actually ironed the tablecloth. Maybe the host spent 3 days preparing a dish they found in a cookbook and spent the whole evening anxiously watching to see whether anyone enjoyed it. Now, multiply that by about 10,000. Add a genuine fear that someone at the table might be trying to end your life. Throw in a cast of 200 attendants whose sole professional purpose is to make sure that does not happen. And then here's the twist. Eat your meal in complete public view while dozens of strangers stand around the room watching you chew. That is roughly what dinner looked like for the kings and queens of early modern Europe. And I want to be very clear. I'm not being poetic. I am being almost entirely literal. Let us start with the food itself, because the sheer scale of what royal courts consumed on a daily basis is genuinely staggering. And it tells us something important about the relationship between excess and authority that I think we too easily dismiss as mere indulgence. When Henry VIII of England was at the height of his reign in the 1530s and 1540s, the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace employed roughly 200 people, 200 just to feed the court. The palace consumed an estimated 1,200 sheep, 1,200 oxmen, and an astonishing 20,000 gall of beer per year. Per year. The beer figure always gets me honestly, but it is worth noting that water was genuinely unsafe to drink in most of Tudor England. So beer was a practical necessity rather than a sign of court excess. Though there was also plenty of excess, to be fair, the feasting culture of the Tudor court was not simply about eating. It was a demonstration of resource. When a king could put 40 courses on a table, and records from certain Tudor banquets suggest that number is not an exaggeration, he was communicating something very precise to every foreign diplomat and every domestic noble in the room. I have so much that I can afford to waste. Try me. It is the same psychology that drives certain modern billionaires to arrive at parties on yachts that have smaller yachts stored inside them. The waste is the point. The waste is the message. But there is another dimension to the royal table that gets far less attention in the popular imagination, and it is the one I find genuinely gripping. The terror of it, because sitting down to eat for a medieval or early modern monarch was not a relaxing experience. Every meal carried with it a very real, very carefully managed anxiety. The possibility that the food placed in front of you had been tampered with. Poisoning was not merely a plot device from a Shakespeare play. It was a documented, recurring feature of political life in royal courts across Europe and beyond. And the court's responses to the threat revealed just how deeply it shaped everyday palace culture. The most elaborate anti-poisoning system in the Western European tradition was probably the one developed in the courts of Italy during the Renaissance, particularly in Florence under the Medici family, and in the various courts of northern Italy, where political assassination by any means available was essentially an accepted instrument of statecraft. The Visconti of Milan were so associated with poisoning in the popular imagination that their enemies referred to them by reputation alone. Whether they actually poisoned as many people as history accuses them of is a legitimate scholarly debate, but the reputation itself tells you everything about the culture. In France, England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, royal courts developed what was called the system of assay, a formal, ceremonial tasting of every dish and every drink before it reached the royal mouth. This was not a quick sip from a servant's cup. It was an elaborate ritual with multiple layers of verification. In the English royal court, for example, the process works something like this. When a dish was prepared in the kitchen, The master cook was required to taste it first. It was then covered, sealed, and transported to the table under supervision. At the table, the carver or the server would taste it again, a specific portion, in front of the monarch before placing it before them. The cupbearer tasted the wine. The ureer, who brought water for hand washing, tasted the water. Every substance that might enter the royal body passed through at least one human being first, whose job it was to not die. Imagine that as a career. What do you do for work? I eat the king's food before he eats it and see if I fall over. There was presumably a pension involved, though the records are unclear on the details. What I find most interesting about the assay system is not the paranoia itself, but how the ritual became detached from its original purpose over time. By the 17th and 17th centuries, in many courts, the ceremony of tasting had become so formalized, so embedded in the theater of royal dining, that it continued long after its practical effectiveness had been significantly questioned. By then, it was not really a security measure. It was a performance of security, a way of saying to the court and to foreign observers, we are so careful, so attentive, so organized, that even the water is tested before it reaches the royal lips. The ritual outlived its function because the ritual had become its own kind of power. Then, there is the question of where the king actually ate and with whom, and what that arrangement revealed about the social order of the court in the French court under Louis XIV. And I want to be careful here, not to repeat ground we have already covered, so I'm going to focus on something we have not discussed yet. The king frequently ate what was called the grand couvert. This was a formal public meal at which the king sat alone at a table raised on a dais, eating in complete solitude, while the court watched from behind a barrier, not watching politely, watching as an event. People came specifically to observe the king eat. Tourists and visitors to Versailles, who had the right connections, could obtain permission to stand in the gallery and watch Louis consume his dinner. There are accounts from the period of visitors describing the experience in their letters home with the same breathless enthusiasm they might use for a theatrical performance or a military parade, which, in a sense, is exactly what it was. The Grank served multiple functions simultaneously. It reinforced the king's separateness from ordinary humanity. He ate alone because no one was quite his equal. It allowed the court to observe his mood and physical state. Is the king eating well today? Is he favoring one dish over another? Does he seem tired? Every gesture was read like a text, and it gave the court a daily gathering point, a shared ritual that pulled everyone's attention back to the center, back to the king morning and evening, day after day. Some historians have written about this practice with a degree of sympathy for Louis, this lonely man eating by himself while crowds observed him. And I understand that impulse, but I think it somewhat misses the point. Louis was not a passive subject of this arrangement. He had designed it. He enjoyed it. He understood with remarkable clarity that being watched was not a vulnerability for a king. It was the whole job. Across the world in the courts of China's Ming and Qing dynasties, the imperial dining ritual operated on a scale and with a precision that makes even the French court look somewhat casual. The emperor's meals were prepared by an imperial kitchen that employed at various points in Chinese dynastic history between 1,000 and 2,000 staff. The recipes were documented and standardized so that the emperor's food tasted exactly the same every time, a consistency that was itself considered a form of cosmic order. The emperor ate from vessels of specific colors on specific days, yellow for ordinary days, red for festivals. Certain ceremonial occasions demanding particular porcelain patterns that had been maintained across generations. Each dish was labeled with a small tablet identifying who had prepared it. This was partly for quality control, but it was also quite explicitly for accountability. If the emperor became ill after eating, the record existed to trace exactly whose hands had touched the food. The tablet system was not subtle about its purpose. It was a very direct way of saying, if something goes wrong, we will know who is responsible. That combination of beauty and accountability, the exquisite presentation of carefully sourced, perfectly prepared food, alongside the cold administrative machinery, ensuring that every cook knew their name was attached to every dish, strikes me as one of the more honest reflections of how imperial power actually worked. Magnificent on the surface, quietly, thoroughly managed underneath. There is a detail I want to leave you with because I think it captures something essential about what it meant to eat as a king. That all the grand descriptions of feasts and ceremonies can sometimes obscure. In many European royal courts, the king did not eat his food hot. By the time a dish had been prepared in a kitchen that might be located some distance from the dining hall, carried through corridors subjected to multiple rounds of assay, ceremonially presented and finally placed before the monarch, it had gone cold, not slightly cool. Cold. Louis XIV, according to memoirs written by courtiers who observed him regularly, was known for eating very quickly. Contemporary accounts suggest he consumed meals at a pace that surprised visitors. There is a plausible argument made by more than one food historian that this speed was simply the practical response of a man who had learned over decades that his food was going to be cold and eating it fast was the most dignified solution available. The most powerful man in France, cold food every single day. There is something in that small human detail that no portrait of Louis in his Man in Gold quite manages to convey. That even inside the most elaborate performance of earthly glory the Western world had ever produced, there were still just the ordinary, unavoidable inconveniences of being a person in a body. The cold soup, the stiff neck from holding a ceremonial posture too long, the sleeplessness, the food that got cold before you could eat it. Power did not insulate you from those things. It just surrounded them with more gold. The kitchen politics, the tasting ceremonies, the public performances at the royal table, all of this was visible, at least to the court that gathered to observe it. But the most consequential conversations at a royal court almost never happened at the dinner table. They happened in rooms that most people never knew existed, in back corridors and private gardens, in letters passed between trusted hands, in whispered exchanges during ceremonies that everyone was watching but no one was meant to hear. The royal court, as we have been slowly discovering, was a place of extraordinary visibility. Everything was performed, everything was observed, and yet, right underneath that surface of constant display, there ran a parallel world of information, secret, deliberate, and ruthless, that shaped the course of kingdoms far more powerfully than any public feast or ceremonial dressing ever could. That is the world we're stepping into next, the world of the court's invisible watchers, the spies who wore livery and served wine and bowed at exactly the right moment, and then reported everything they had seen to the people who were paying them to do exactly that. There is a man standing in the corner of the room. He has been there for the past 2 hours. He is dressed in palace livery, that precise combination of colors that identifies him as a servant of the household, invisible in the way that furniture is invisible. Noticed only when something needs to be poured or carried or cleared away. His face is neutral, his posture is correct. He is to all appearances doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing. But he is listening. He is listening to the conversation between the 2 noblemen near the fireplace, who have been talking quietly for the past 20 minutes, apparently assuming that the man in the corner is not paying attention. He is noting the name of the foreign ambassador who arrived this afternoon and spent an unusually long time in a side gallery speaking to a particular court lady. He's remembering the letter he saw being passed discreetly at the end of the evening meal, folded small, slipped from one sleeve to another in a motion so practiced it was nearly invisible. And tomorrow morning, or perhaps tonight, if the information seems urgent enough, he will write down everything he has seen and heard, and that document will find its way to the person who is paying him to produce it. He is not what we would call a spy, not officially. He He has no formal title that acknowledges this function. He is just a servant, a member of the household staff, one of hundreds of people moving through the palace every single day, filling cups and lighting candles and drawing baths. He's also one of the most important people in the building. The intelligence networks that operated inside royal courts have never quite gotten the dramatic treatment they deserve. And I think that is largely because they do not look like what we expect spying to look like. There are no gadgets, no elaborate cover stories, no dangerous missions to foreign capitals. The most effective court intelligence was almost mundanely domestic. It was simply the systematic cultivation of people who were already in the right rooms doing the right jobs and willing to share what they observed. Every major European court from the medieval period through the early modern era operated some version of this system. The specifics varied. The sophistication varied enormously, but the underlying logic was constant in an environment where information was power. The person who controlled the flow of information controlled the court. Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of France under King Louis XIII in the 1620s and 1630s, understood this with a clarity that was frankly terrifying, even by the standards of the time. Richelieu built what historians have described as the first systematic state intelligence apparatus in French history, a network of informants, interceptors, and analysts that reached into every corner of the French court and a significant portion of the European diplomatic community beyond it. He employed a man named Father Isef Franis Leclerc du Temps Bibli, a Capuchin friar who became Richelieu's closest confidential agent and was so deeply embedded in the cardinal's intelligence operations that contemporaries referred to him as the Grey Eminence. The term is passed into the English language as a phrase for a shadowy figure, exercising power behind a more visible leader, and it originated specifically from this man in this court in this period. Father Joseph was remarkable not because he was physically dangerous or because he undertook dramatic operations. He was remarkable because he understood that the most valuable intelligence was relational. It came from knowing people, from maintaining trust, across a wide network of contacts, from being present in conversations that no one thought to exclude him from, because he was, after all, just a friar, a religious man, harmless. He was not harmless. But let me take you somewhere that most people do not think of when they imagine court intrigue. Because the conventional picture of royal spying tends to center on Western Europe, on England and France and the Italian city-states. And that picture, while accurate as far as it goes, is dramatically incomplete. The imperial court of the Byzantine Empire, which survived for roughly 11 centuries from the founding of Constantinople in 330 until its fall in 1453, developed intelligence practices that made Renaissance Italy look like amateurs. The Byzantines had a term, Scotty Noi, for the secret agents and informers who moved through the court and the empire gathering information. The system was not centralized in the way Richelieu's network was. It was more diffuse, more layered, more embedded into the basic functioning of court life. The palace eunuchs, men who occupied administrative and domestic roles throughout the Byzantine court and who had access to the most private spaces of the imperial household, were frequently both the subjects of intelligence gathering and its instruments. They heard things, they saw things, and because their social position was in many ways ambiguous, neither fully inside the masculine world of military and political power, nor outside the intimate spaces of the imperial family, they could move between worlds in ways that other people could not. The historian Prupius, writing in the 6th century, produced a document known as the Secret History, a text so scandalous and so relentlessly critical of the Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora that Procopius clearly expected it would never be published in his own lifetime. In it, he describes a court in which surveillance was so pervasive and trust so fragile that even the closest advisors to the emperor lived in a state of permanent anxiety. He writes of people who had served loyally for decades, finding themselves suddenly ruined based on a single denunciation, A single whispered accusation passed to the right ear. Whether Procopius's account is entirely reliable is a matter of historical debate. He clearly had personal grievances against Justinian, and his secret history reads in places more like a revenge document than a neutral record. But the texture of the world he describes, the paranoia, the shifting alliances, the sudden reversals of fortune, align closely enough with what we know from other sources to suggest that the general picture is accurate, even if some specific details are exaggerated. What I find most haunting about the Byzantine intelligence culture is not its effectiveness. It is the atmosphere it created. When surveillance is diffuse enough, when you genuinely cannot be sure which of your colleagues or servants or friends might be reporting your words to someone else, the result is not just political caution, it is a kind of existential loneliness. You cannot fully trust anyone, because anyone might be the one who heard what you said and decided to use it. You perform always for an audience you cannot see. We talked in our second chapter about how the architecture of the Topkapi Palace made the Sultan simultaneously visible and invisible. This is the human version of that same principle. The intelligence network made every conversation in the court potentially observed, which meant that every conversation was, in a sense, a performance. England, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, offers what is perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of court intelligence in the English-speaking world, and it is worth spending some time here because the story involves one of the most remarkable figures in the history of political espionage. Francis Walsingham served as principal secretary to Elizabeth from 1573 to 17 years, in which he essentially built and operated England's first professional intelligence service. By the end of his tenure, Walsingham maintained a network of approximately 50 agents operating across Europe, with sources in France, Spain, the Italian states, the Ottoman Empire, and the Netherlands. He intercepted diplomatic correspondence. He cultivated informants inside foreign embassies in London. He ran what might be fairly described as a code ring operation, employing skilled cryptographers to decipher the encrypted letters that passed between foreign powers and their agents in England. He's perhaps most famous in historical memory for the operation that led to the uncovering of the Babington Plot in 1586, a conspiracy to remove Elizabeth from the throne and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Walsingham did not simply discover this plot, he penetrated it. He had an agent inside the conspiracy who allowed the plotters to believe their communications were secure, while every letter they wrote was being read in Walsingham's office. When the evidence was sufficient, he closed the trap. The cost to Walsingham personally was considerable. He spent money far beyond what the crown reimbursed him for maintaining his network. He died in 1590 in considerable debt and was buried quietly at night, partly according to some accounts, to avoid his creditors. A man who had spent 17 years protecting the most powerful woman in England could not afford a dignified funeral. There is a complicated lesson in that somewhere about the relationship between those who exercise power and those who protect it. Though I suspect Walsingham, who was nothing if not clear-eyed about the nature of the world he worked in, would not have found it surprising. What I want to draw your attention to across all of these examples, Richelieu's France, Byzantine, Constantinople, Elizabeth, and England, is a pattern that I find genuinely illuminating about human nature and the way power actually functions. Every single one of these intelligence systems relied at its core, not on technology or military force, but on human relationships, on trust or the simulation of trust, on the willingness of one person to confide in another, and on the willingness of that other person to take what had been confided and use it. The servants who reported conversations, the friars who cultivated contacts, the agents who pretended to be loyal members of a conspiracy while feeding information to the other side. All of them were at the most fundamental level exploiting the basic human need to be heard, to be trusted, to have someone to talk to. Think about that for a moment. In one of the most tightly surveilled environments in human history, the royal court, where everything was observed and nothing was private, people still talked, still confided, still passed notes and whispered by fireplaces and wrote letters they believed were secret, because the need to communicate, to connect, to share a thought with another human being is simply stronger than the knowledge that you probably should not. The court intelligence networks did not create that vulnerability. They simply found it and built their entire machinery around it. By now, we've looked at the surface of the court, the ceremonies, and the architecture. And we have looked at what ran beneath that surface in the shadows. The information, the watching, the carefully maintained networks of people who turned trust into a commodity. But there is one room in the palace we have not yet entered, one that was more closely guarded than the king's own bedchamber, one that generated more political crises, more dynastic upheaval, and more raw human drama than any council chamber or throne room ever did. The bedroom, not the king's ceremonial bedroom, which we've already visited. The private one, the one where the rules of the court officially ended, and the much messier, much more human rules of desire and succession and desperate personal need began. Because the politics of who shared a royal bed and what that sharing meant for kingdoms, for bloodlines, and for the men and women caught in the middle of it, is a story that puts everything else we have discussed in an entirely different light. And it starts with a question that courts across the world spent centuries trying to answer. When a king and queen go to bed, who exactly is responsible for making sure an heir results from it? The answer, as it turns out, involves a surprisingly large number of people who are required to be present in the room. We ended our last chapter with a question that I suspect has been sitting with you perhaps uncomfortably ever since. When a king and queen went to bed together, who exactly was responsible for making sure there were witnesses? The answer across most of the major royal courts of Europe was quite a lot of people, actually, and they took their responsibilities very seriously. Let me walk you into one of the most intimate and frankly strangest traditions in the history of monarchy, and I want to approach this with the same seriousness that the courts themselves brought to it, because underneath what sounds like absurdity was a logic that was given the stakes entirely rational. The legitimacy of a royal heir was the most politically consequential fact in the life of a kingdom, not the king's military victories, not his legislation, not his alliances. The question of who would sit on the throne after him, whether that child was genuinely his, whether the queen had in fact produced the heir she claimed, whether the bloodline was unbroken and uncontested, that question was worth wars. It had caused wars. It would cause more. And so European royal courts developed what we might call the politics of the witnessed bed. In France, the tradition was perhaps the most formalized. When the queen gave birth, the room was required to be open to witnesses, noble women of rank court officials. Sometimes dozens of people crowded into the royal bedchamber. The purpose was unambiguous: to ensure that no child could be secretly substituted. No false birth claimed, no heir manufactured out of political convenience. If the queen delivered a son, while witnesses of high standing were present and watching, the legitimacy of that son was essentially unimpeachable. The birth of Louis XIV himself, in September of 1638, was witnessed by an enormous crowd packed into the Queen's chamber at the Château de Saint-Germain on Le. Their contemporary described the room as being so crowded that the air was barely breathable. This was a feature, not a flaw. Every body in that room was a potential witness. Every witness was a piece of insurance against future challenges to the child's claim. But the witnessed bed extended beyond birth. The royal wedding night itself, the first night that a newly married king and queen spent together, was also, in many courts, a semi-public event. Senior nobles and court officials would escort the couple to the chamber, participate in formal rituals of preparation, and in some traditions, remain present for at least the initial portion of the night to confirm that the marriage had been entered into in a manner that the court could formally attest to. For the couple in the bed, I will leave the emotional dimension of that experience to your imagination. The marriage of Marie Antoinette and the future Louis XVI in May of 1770 provides one of the most humanly affecting examples of how this tradition played out and how badly it could go wrong. Marie Antoinette was 14 years old when she arrived in France to marry the 15-year-old Dauphin. The wedding was held at Versailles on the 16th of May, 1770, followed by an enormous public celebration. That evening, the young couple was ceremonially escorted to the royal bedchamber in a procession that involved virtually the entire court. What happened, or rather what did not happen, over the next 7 years became one of the central political crises of the French monarchy. The marriage was not consummated for approximately 7 years. The historical record on exactly why is genuinely complicated, and I want to be careful here to represent what is known rather than what has been assumed. Later accounts, including a letter from Maria Antoinette's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, who visited France in 1777 specifically to address the problem, suggest the issue was partly physical and partly psychological. Joseph's letter to his brother, clinical, unsentimental, written in the direct manner of a man who was used to solving problems, describes the situation with a frankness that would have been utterly scandalous if made public at the time. But from the perspective of the French court and the watching world, all that mattered was the absence of an heir. Year after year, the couple that everyone had watched being escorted to the royal chamber had produced nothing. The court gossiped. Foreign courts observed. Pamphlets began to circulate in Paris, crude, anonymous, viciously satirical, suggesting interpretations of the situation that ranged from unflattering to genuinely dangerous for the monarchy's reputation. Marie Antoinette's letters to her mother, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, during this period are among the most poignant documents in royal history. She was a teenager in a foreign country, surrounded by people who were cataloging her failure to produce an heir and circulating that failure as entertainment. The gap between the gilded surface of Versailles, the dresses, the parties, the gardens, the endless performance of royal magnificence, and the private reality of a young woman under impossible pressure is nowhere more visible than in those letters. She finally gave birth to her first child, a daughter, in December of 1778. A son followed in 1781. But the damage to her public reputation had been done, and the years of speculation had planted seeds of contempt in the popular imagination that the arrival of children could not fully reverse. The institution of the royal mistress deserves its own careful examination here because it is so easily misunderstood, treated either as pure scandal or as simple evidence of royal excess, when in fact, it was a far more complex and in some ways surprisingly structured feature of court life. In the French court, the position of maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress recognized and acknowledged by the court, carried genuine political weight. This was not merely a matter of personal indulgence. The king's acknowledged favorite had access to his private hours, his unguarded thoughts, his moods before the day's performance had fully assembled itself. Sound familiar? We described something similar when we talked about the men who attended the morning lever. The difference was that the royal mistress had axes of a more fundamental kind and correspondingly more influence. Jeanne Antoinette Bassot, known to history as Madame de Pompadour, is perhaps the most remarkable example of what this position could become in the hands of someone with genuine political intelligence. She became the official mistress of Louis XV in 1745 and maintained that position, and more importantly, her political influence until her death in 1764. That is nearly 20 years of continuous access to the most powerful man in France. What makes her story genuinely extraordinary is what she did with that access. Pompadour was not merely a companion. She was an advisor, a patron of the arts, a diplomatic intermediary, and at certain points effectively a co-administrator of French policy. She influenced ministerial appointments. She supported the 7 Years' War alliance with Austria, a reversal of long-standing French foreign policy, so dramatic that it is sometimes called the diplomatic revolution of 1756, and her role in facilitating it is documented in contemporary diplomatic correspondence. She patronized Voltaire, supported the Encyclopédie, the great project of the French Enlightenment, and commissioned an enormous body of art, architecture, and decorative work that shaped French cultural taste for a generation. She did all of this from a position that had no formal legal status, no official title in the machinery of government, no seat on any council. Her power was entirely relational. It came from proximity, from trust, from 17 years of daily access to the king's private life. Which brings us back in a very direct way to the argument we've been building throughout this entire conversation. In a royal court, access was power. Full stop. Everything else was decoration. I want to pause here for a moment and offer a thought that I find myself returning to whenever I spend time with the stories of women in royal courts. And I say this not to make a political point, but simply because I think it is historically honest. The women who moved through these spaces as queens, as mistresses, as ladies-in-waiting, as mothers of heirs, operated under constraints that the men around them did not face to the same degree. Their bodies were political instruments in a way that male bodies generally were not. Their value to the court was tied always to their reproductive capacity and their sexual behavior in a way that applied with far less force to even the most scrutinized king. And yet within those constraints, the women who understood the court best found extraordinary latitude for influence, agency, and genuine power. Catherine de' Medici, whom we will discuss more fully in our chapter on women behind the throne, essentially governed France for decades. Elizabeth I, who never married and never produced an heir, turned that very absence into a political instrument of remarkable sophistication. Pompadour shaped the cultural and diplomatic history of a nation from a position that officially did not exist. The constraints were real. The agency within them was also real. I think we do these women a disservice, whether in admiring them or criticizing them, when we collapse that complexity into something simpler than it actually was. There is one more thread I want to pull before we move on, because I think it illuminates something about the royal bedroom that the grand romantic narratives tend to obscure. Succession anxiety, the fear that no heir would come, or that the heir who came would be contested, or that the line would end was not merely a political problem. It was a psychological condition that shaped the behavior of rulers in ways that rippled through every aspect of court life. Henry VIII of England is the most dramatic example in the English-speaking tradition, and his story has been told so many times that I want to approach it from an angle that is less often emphasized. We tend to focus on the marriages themselves, the wives, the fates, the famous arithmetic of divorced beheaded died, divorced beheaded survived. But what we sometimes lose in that recitation is the emotional texture of a man who genuinely could not understand why the legitimate male heir that he needed and that he believed he deserved kept failing to arrive. Catherine of Aragon had at least 6 pregnancies. Only 1 child survived infancy, a daughter, Mary. Anne Boleyn produced 1 surviving child, a daughter, Elizabeth. Jane Seymour finally gave Henry his son Edward in 1537 and died 12 days after the birth. Henry's 6 marriages were not at their core a story of lust or cruelty, though there was certainly some of both. They were the story of a king dismantling and reassembling the most intimate dimension of his personal life, again and again, in pursuit of a political necessity that his body and the bodies of the women he married seemed unable to provide. The desperation in that is genuinely human, even as the consequences for the people around him were often devastating. The bedroom in a royal court was never private in the way we understand privacy. It It was always also a stage, always also a political space, always watched, always analyzed, always invested with the significance that ordinary people who could go to bed without witnesses, without the future of a dynasty, depending on the outcome, simply could not fully imagine. The stories of succession of heirs and pretenders, of marriages made for dynasties rather than people. All of these bring us naturally to one of the most neglected groups in the entire history of royal courts: the children, not the heirs who survived to rule, not the princes who became kings and the princesses who married into foreign courts and are remembered in history books, but the children as children, small people living inside these enormous, complex, politically charged environments, raised by strangers trained from infancy to perform roles they had not chosen and could not refuse. What was it actually like to grow up inside a royal court? The answer is far stranger and far sadder than most of us have ever been told. There is a portrait that I keep coming back to whenever I think about what it meant to be a child inside a royal court. It hangs in the Kastilstor's Museum in Vienna, painted in 1653 by the Spanish court painter Diego Velázquez. The subject is the Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain, daughter of King Philip IV, and she is 3 years old. She's wearing a dress so heavily constructed, so armored with wire hoops and embroidered panels and silver thread, that it would have been physically impossible for a child to run in it. Her hair is dressed and pinned. Her posture is erect. Her expression for a 3-year-old is remarkable in its composure. The particular stillness of a child who has already been taught somehow that certain faces are acceptable and certain faces are not. She looks in short like a very small adult, a miniature courtier, a tiny political instrument dressed up in the most expensive fabric that the wealthiest empire in the world could produce, and that it turns out is almost exactly what she was. Before we go any further, I want to offer a perspective on royal childhood that I think gets lost between the romantic version, princes in fairy tale castles, children raised in luxury beyond imagination, and the simply critical version, which focuses on the obvious hardships. The truth is more interesting than either of those framings. The truth is that royal children lived inside a system that was not designed for children at all. It was designed for dynasties, and those are very different things. A dynasty needs heirs. It needs alliances. It needs the perpetuation of bloodlines, the maintenance of political relationships across borders and generations, the strategic management of marriage contracts that might be negotiated before a child could read. The children who happened to be born into that system were in a structural sense assets, not in the way that term sounds when applied to human beings, not crui, not without affection, but in the precise political meaning of the word. They were resources that the dynasty would deploy, and the courts organized the lives of royal children around that deployment with a thoroughness that would be startling to modern sensibilities, even when it was carried out with genuine care. The physical separation of royal children from their parents began in most European courts almost immediately after birth. This was not neglect, it was protocol. The royal nursery was a separate establishment within the palace, or sometimes in a separate palace entirely staffed by its own hierarchy of nurses, governesses, tutors, and attendants. The reasoning was partly practical. Infants were vulnerable to disease, and keeping them at a physical distance from the main court reduced exposure to infection. It was also partly hierarchical. The nursery had its own rituals, its own rules of access, its own carefully managed environment designed to prepare the child for the life that was coming. What it meant in practice was that royal children were raised primarily by employees rather than parents. The relationship between Louis XIV and his own childhood caregivers illustrates this with particular clarity. His primary nurse, a woman named Pere Dufour, was in many ways the most significant adult presence in his earliest years, more physically present than his mother, Anne of Austria, who had her own ceremonial life to maintain, and far more present than his father, King Louis XIII, who was frequently unwell and somewhat emotionally distant by temperament. Parade Dufour was eventually granted a nobility title and a pension for her service, which tells you something about how seriously the court took the role. But here is the complication. The nurse, however devoted, was also an employee. Her presence was contingent on the court's approval. Her authority over the child ended the moment the child grew old enough to be transferred to the next phase of education. The relationships that royal children formed in their earliest years were relationships with people who could be, and regularly were, replaced, reassigned, or dismissed. Imagine building your understanding of human connection on relationships that are primarily transactional. That shape might stay with you. Formal education began early, and the curriculum that royal children were subjected to was designed to produce not a happy or well-rounded person, but a functioning monarch. By the age of 5 or 6, a prince in the French, Spanish, or English courts would typically be learning Latin modern languages. French was essential as the diplomatic language of Europe. Regardless of the child's nationality, history, rhetoric, mathematics, and music, physical training was constant riding, fencing, dancing, and military exercises were not extracurriculars. They were core subjects. A king who could not ride competently or handle himself in a ceremonial military context was a liability. The sheer number of hours that went into this education is almost exhausting to contemplate. Philip II of Spain, who had become one of the most powerful and most overworked monarchs in European history, spent his childhood under a regimen so intensive that his tutors later recalled he rarely had an unscheduled hour. He grew up to be a king who worked 18-hour days and died at the age of 71, having personally annotated hundreds of thousands of state documents. Whether his extraordinary capacity for sustained, detailed administrative labor was temperament or training is an interesting question, and the answer is probably both. The English royal children under the Tudor provide a particularly well-documented case study because the Tudor court kept meticulous records, and several of the children who grew up within it were remarkable enough to generate extensive correspondence and memoir material. The future Edward V, the son Henry VIII, finally received from Jane Seymour, began formal academic study at the age of approximately 5.5. By the age of 7, he was reading Cato in Latin. By 9, he was writing letters in Latin, French, and English and had begun Greek. His tutor, John Cheek, was one of the most distinguished classical scholars in England, and the education he provided was genuinely rigorous by any standard. Edward was also, of course, the heir to the throne of England. He was 9 years old when his father died in 1547. 9. He never had a childhood in any meaningful sense of the word. He had a preparation for a reign that lasted 6 years before tuberculosis ended his life at the age of 15. But the aspect of royal childhood that I find most quietly devastating, more so than the rigorous education or the physical separation from parents, is the marriage negotiations. The practice of arranging royal marriages years, sometimes decades, in advance of the actual wedding was standard across virtually every European and many non-European courts throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The logic was pragmatic. Royal marriages were the primary diplomatic tool for cementing alliances between kingdoms, and the earlier an agreement was reached, the longer the two families had to build the relationship and ensure the match actually happened. What this meant in practice was that children were promised in marriage before they had any capacity to understand what marriage meant. Isabella of Valois was betrothed to the future Richard II of England when she was 6 years old in 1386. She married him in 1396 when she was 6 and he was 29. She was widowed at 10 when Richard was deposed and subsequently died. She was then betrothed again to a prince she'd never met before. She herself died in childbirth at the age of 19. That life from betrothal at 6 to death at 19 traversed 3 countries, 2 marriages, a deposition, a widowhood, and a diplomatic career as a royal pawn that would have been exhausting for a fully grown adult diplomat. She was by every account a gentle and somewhat bewildered child who did her best to navigate an environment that had been constructed entirely around other people's political needs. I find her story almost unbearable, if I am honest. Not because it is the most dramatic royal story it is not, but because of its sheer ordinariness in the context of the time. This happened to royal children constantly. It was not considered unusual or cruel. It was simply how things were done. The Spanish Habsburgs provide perhaps the most documented and most clinically interesting case study in what happens to a royal family when the marriage alliance system is taken to its extreme logical conclusion. For roughly 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs maintained their dynastic bloodline through a pattern of marriage between close relatives, cousins, marrying cousins, uncles, marrying nieces, designed to keep the Habsburg inheritance consolidated and the bloodline pure. The political logic was clear. The biological consequences over generations were severe. The last of the Spanish Habsburg kings, Charles II, who reigned from 1665 until his death in 1700, was so profoundly affected by the accumulated genetic effects of this intergenerational consanguinity that contemporary accounts describe him as barely functional by the end of his life. He could not chew solid food due to the severity of his prominent jaw, a physical trait that had appeared in his dynasty for generations but reached its most extreme expression in him. He was unable to produce an heir. The marriage alliance system that had been designed to consolidate the dynasty ultimately destroyed it. He knew apparently what he was. There are accounts of Charles II in his later years expressing a kind of resigned self-awareness about his condition. A man who understood with whatever capacity remained to him that he was the end of a line, that the system that had produced him had consumed itself in producing him. It is one of the more haunting endings in the history of royal dynasties, a 200-year project of political calculation, culminating in a man who could not eat properly and died, leaving no heir. The dynasty had weaponized its children for so long that it had ultimately weaponized itself out of existence. I do not want to leave this chapter entirely in darkness, though, because the history of royal childhood is not only tragedy. It is also, in some remarkable cases, the story of children who absorbed extraordinary educations, formed complicated and genuinely meaningful relationships within the constraints of court life, and grew into people of unusual depth and capability. Elizabeth Frey was the product of a Tudor upbringing that killed her mother before she had any memory of her, subjected her to periods of imprisonment and genuine danger, and denied her any stable sense of personal safety for years. And she emerged as arguably the most politically sophisticated ruler England has ever produced. The crucible of royal childhood did not always destroy what was placed inside it. Sometimes it made something extraordinary, but extraordinary is not the same as happy, and I think the children of kings deserve to have both of those things acknowledged. The children grew up. Some of them became rulers. Some became diplomatic currency. Some became cautionary tales. And as they moved through the court as young adults, as political actors in their own right, they encountered a figure who inhabited the palace in a way that nobody else quite did. Someone who was present at every feast, every ceremony, every moment of high seriousness, and whose entire job was to stand there and puncture all of it. Someone who was by tradition and by royal appointment the only person in the palace who was formally permitted to tell the king the truth, the court jester. And the history of that role is so much stranger, so much darker, and so much more psychologically complex than the jokes and the bells and the painted face suggest. That is exactly where we are heading next. Every court had one. Sometimes they wore bells on their hat. Sometimes they carried a wooden scepter topped with a carved head, a prop called a maro, which the jester would address as though it were a tiny king mocking the real one indirectly through the puppet. They tumbled, they juggled, they told jokes, they sang songs that were just slightly too close to the truth for comfort. And in a building where every word was measured, every gesture observed, every expression potentially misread and reported, they were the only people in the room who were allowed to say exactly what they thought. Think about how remarkable that is for a moment. Inside one of the most surveilled, most politically charged environments in human civilization, a place where men had lost their positions, their estates, and occasionally their lives for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, there existed a designated role for someone whose entire job was to be dangerously honest, to point out the emperor's new clothes, to name the thing everyone was thinking, but no one dared to say. The court jester was not merely an entertainer. They were in a very real sense a safety valve, a pressure release mechanism for an environment that would otherwise have been psychologically unsustainable. And the more closely you look at the history of these figures, the more specific the cases become, the more you realize that the role was far more complex and far more dangerous than the bells and the funny hats suggest. The formal role of court fool or court jester existed in some form across virtually every major civilization that maintained a royal court in medieval and Renaissance Europe and the Ottoman Empire and the courts of India, under the Mughal emperors, in China, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The specific shape of the role varied. The underlying function did not. That universality is itself worth pausing on. When a social institution appears independently in cultures with no contact with one another, it usually means the institution is solving a genuine human problem. The court jester was solving the problem of what happens when nobody is allowed to tell the king he is wrong, because the consequences of that problem of a ruler with no honest feedback, surrounded by people who agree with everything he says out of self-preservation, are historically catastrophic. Bad decisions get made. Obvious errors go uncorrected. The gap between the king's perception of reality and actual reality widens until it becomes dangerous. The jester was the court's crude but effective solution. Give one person formal license to be honest. Let them speak the unspeakable through the protective framing of comedy and hope that the king is wise enough and secure enough in his own power to hear the truth underneath the joke. It was a delicate transaction, and it did not always work. Will Sommers is probably the most well-documented court jester in English history, and his story illustrates both the extraordinary latitude that the role could confer and the very real precariousness that came with it. Sommers entered the service of Henry VIII sometime around 1525, when Henry was at the height of his power and his court was one of the most politically dangerous environments in Europe. He remained Henry's fool for the rest of the king's life through 6 marriages, the dissolution of the monasteries, the break with Rome, the executions of friends and ministers and wives. He outlasted Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Anne Boleyn. He outlasted Cardinal Wolsey. He outlasted, in short, virtually everyone else who was close to Henry during those years. That longevity is itself remarkable. The Tudor court was not a forgiving environment. People who fell out of favor with Henry did not typically retire quietly to the country. Sommers survived because he understood the role with extraordinary precision. He knew exactly where the line was between the uncomfortable truth that Henry could hear, framed as a joke, and the uncomfortable truth that would get even a jester into serious difficulty. There are contemporary accounts, some more reliable than others, of Henry flying into rages at Sommers' jokes, and then within minutes laughing at them, of Sommers being the only person who could approach the king during his blackest moods and reliably improve them, of Sommers making pointed remarks about court politics and royal policy that no courtier or minister could have voiced without risking everything. One account recorded by the chronicler John Leland and referenced by later Todier historians, describes Somers making a remark to Henry that directly touched on Cardinal Wolsey, at a time when Wolsey was still at the height of his influence, and such a remark from any other source would have been genuinely dangerous. Henry apparently laughed. Wolsey did not. The jester's license was real, but it was also entirely dependent on the king's goodwill. The moment the king stopped finding it funny, the license evaporated, and several jesters in history discovered that boundary by crossing it, usually at considerable personal cost. Here is where the history gets genuinely darker, and I want to approach it carefully because it involves something that sits very uneasily with modern sensibilities. Alongside the professional jesters, men and women hired for their wit, their physical comedy, their musical ability, and their trained capacity for improvisation, royal courts across Europe and the Ottoman Empire maintained what contemporaries called natural fools. This term referred to people with intellectual disabilities, dwarfism, or other physical conditions that made them, in the perception of the time, inherently interesting or entertaining in ways the court wished to keep close. The keeping of dwarfs at royal courts was so widespread across European history that it almost constitutes its own sub-institution. The Spanish Habsburgs were particularly documented in this regard. Diego Velázquez, the same painter whose portrait of the Infanta Margarita Teresa we discussed in our last chapter, painted a series of remarkable portraits of the court dwarfs of Philip IV's court in Madrid in the 1640s and 1650s. These paintings are among the most psychologically complex works in Western art history, precisely because Velázquez does something that almost no other court painter of the period does. He looks at these individuals as people, as subjects with interior lives, not objects of spectacle. His portrait of Sebastian d'Ora, a court dwarf in the service of first the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand and later the young Prince Balthazar Charles, is a study in compressed dignity. D'Ora sits with his hands closed in his lap, his legs extended before him, unable to reach the floor, and looks directly at the viewer with an expression of such intelligence and such self-possession that it stops you cold. He is not performing. He's not amusing. He is simply present in his full humanity, looking back at us across 4 centuries. We do not know much about Sebastian d'Ora's inner life. The documentary record of court dwarfs is thin precisely because they were not considered important enough to generate correspondence or memoir material. But Velázquez's portrait preserves something, a kind of witness that the official court record does not. The question that I find most difficult to sit with when thinking about court dwarfs and natural fools is the question of what they understood about their own situation. Because there is evidence, fragmentary but real, that some of these individuals exercised a degree of genuine agency within the role they had been assigned, that some of them used the license afforded to the fool, the social permission to be present in spaces normally closed to people of their status, to accumulate small measures of influence and protection within the court hierarchy. Tribula, whose real name was Nicholas Fiel, and who served as court fool to both Louis VI 12th and Francis III of France in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, is one of the more documented cases. Contemporary sources credit him with jokes and remarks that navigated the political landscape of the French court with considerable sophistication. He was by multiple accounts genuinely funny, but he was also, apparently, genuinely shrewd. The two things were connected. To survive as a court fool for decades across multiple reigns and multiple shifts in court politics required a social intelligence that the role's apparent absurdity could easily cause you to overlook. There is an anecdote, I cannot verify its literal accuracy, but it appears in multiple independent sources about Tribule making a remark to Francis I that came dangerously close to insulting the king. Francis, the story goes, told Tribule that the punishment for such a remark was death, but that as a special favor the fool could choose the manner of his passing. Triplet, without missing a beat, replied that he chose death by old age. Francis laughed and pardoned him. Whether or not that exchange happened exactly as described, the story reveals something true about the dynamic between jesters and kings. The best of them understood that their continued existence depended on being indispensable, and being indispensable required being irreplaceable, not just funny, uniquely, specifically, irreplaceably funny to this particular king, in this particular court, at this particular moment in history. It was a kind of job security that required constant, exhausting reinvention. The Ottoman court had its own rich tradition of this role. The court entertainers and comic figures attached to the Sultan's household, who operated within a very different cultural and religious framework from their European counterparts. Where the European jester often drew on Christian imagery and the familiar stories of court life for comedic material, Ottoman entertainers worked within a set of constraints where certain targets were genuinely impermissible. The latitude was different. The underlying need for someone who could puncture the seriousness of power, who could make the Sultan laugh at himself, was the same. Nasrid Hoda, a folkloric figure whose stories circulated throughout the Ottoman world, and the broader Islamic tradition for centuries, represents in his legendary form something very close to the ideal of the wise fool, the man who appears ridiculous and speaks apparent absurdity, and in doing so consistently exposes the pretensions of the powerful. Whether Nasrid Hajar was a historical person, a composite of several individuals, or a purely fictional creation accumulated across generations of storytelling, is a question scholars have never fully resolved. The stories attributed to him span too many centuries and too many geographical contexts to belong to a single life. But the stories themselves, in which judges and merchants and men of great official importance are consistently outmaneuvered by a man on a donkey who pretends not to understand how the world works, tell you something important about what the audiences for those stories needed to believe that the powerful are not as clever as they think they are, and that sometimes the most honest person in the room is the one everyone assumes is joking. There is a dimension to the court jester's role that rarely gets discussed in popular history, and I want to spend a moment on it because I think it illuminates something true about how human beings function under sustained pressure. The jesters who survived longest, who remembered most vividly, were not simply funny. They were emotionally intelligent in a very specific way. They knew how to hold a mirror up to the court without making anyone feel attacked. They delivered criticism in a form that the recipient could accept, could even enjoy, while the message still landed. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Most of us, when we need to tell someone something they do not want to hear, either soften it so much that it loses its meaning, or deliver it so bluntly that the recipient becomes defensive and cannot hear it at all. The professional jester had to find the precise middle path every single day in front of the most powerful and most easily offended audience imaginable. I think sometimes about the modern equivalents of this function: the political satire, the comedian who targets the sitting president, the editorial cartoonist, the late-night host who gets laughs by saying what the news anchors will not. These roles still serve the same function. The court gesture served centuries ago. They allow a society to process and articulate criticism of its leaders in a form that is publicly acceptable, precisely because it is framed as comedy. The framing does not make the criticism less real. It makes it survivable. By now, you might be wondering, and I would be too, whether the court ever had someone who exercised real substantive power without the permission of jokes or the protection of license. Someone who did not need to be funny, who did not need a formal role, who simply understood the game well enough to play it at the highest level without a title that acknowledged what they were actually doing. The answer is yes, and those people were more often than not women, not the queens who sat in ceremonial thrones beside their husbands, not the royal mistresses whose influence depended on personal access, but the women who built power systems of their own through information through networks, through the patient accumulation of relationships and leverage over years and decades. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France as a 14-year-old girl with no political standing and the unflattering nickname the merchant's daughter. She left as one of the most powerful figures of the 16th century. How she got from one to the other is a story that cuts straight to the heart of how power actually works inside a royal court. And it is exactly where we are heading next. Catherine de' Medici was 14 years old when she arrived in France to marry the Duke of Orleans in 1533. She brought with her a substantial douai, a Florentine accent that the French court found somewhat amusing, and a family name that was associated more with banking and commerce than with the ancient royal bloodlines that French aristocrats spent considerable energy maintaining. They called her Lame Chande, the merchant's daughter, not to her face at Carfabus, of course, but she knew. She always knew. She was not loved. She was not particularly respected. She was a political transaction, a piece of Medici money attached to a Valois prince, useful for the diplomatic relationship between France and the papacy, largely irrelevant for everything else. Her husband Henry had a mistress he adored, Diane de Poitiers, 20 years his senior, a woman of extraordinary poise and intelligence who occupied the emotional center of Henry's life in a way that his wife simply did not. For the first decade of her marriage, Catherine de' Medici was effectively invisible. She watched, she learned, she survived, and then over the following 30 years, she became the most powerful person in France. I want to tell you how she did it, not as a story of scheming and villain, which is how she is usually portrayed, but as a study in the most sophisticated understanding of court power that the 16th century produced. Because what Catherine did was not dark magic or poison or conspiracy. It was something much more impressive and much more applicable to understanding how power actually works. It was patience and attention and the willingness to spend years building something that would only pay off when the moment was right. Henry II died in a jousting accident in 1559. It was one of those random, senseless events that history occasionally delivers to remind us that for all the planning and scheming and careful architecture of power, sometimes a splinter of broken lance through a visor at exactly the wrong angle changes everything. Henry was 40 years old. Their eldest son, Francis, became King Francis II at 15, a sickly boy who would reign for less than 2 years before tuberculosis took him at 16. Then, their second son, Charles, became Charles IX at 10 years old. Then, when Charles died at 23, from what contemporaries described as a collapse of his health, their third son became Henry III. 3 sons, 3 kings, all of them minors or near minors when they came to the throne. All of them in different ways and to different degrees actually functionally governed by their mother. Catherine served as regent during the minority of Charles IX from 1560 to 1563. But her influence extended far beyond the formal regency. She corresponded personally with foreign monarchs. She negotiated treaties. She managed the catastrophically fractured religious landscape of France during the Wars of Religion, the devastating conflict between Catholics and Huguenot Protestants that tore the country apart across the second half of the 16th century, with the flexibility of a diplomat who understood that ideological purity was a luxury that a country on the edge of civil collapse could not afford. She made the Edict of January in 1562, which granted Huguenots the right to worship outside town walls, the first formal recognition of Protestant rights in French history. She negotiated the Peace of Ambire in 1563. She organized the Grand Tour of France in 1564 to 15. It's a 2-year journey across the kingdom with the young Charles and the full court, designed to show the royal family to the French people and rebuild trust after years of conflict. She was not always right. The Saint. Bartholomew's Day events of 1572, in which thousands of Huguenots were killed across France, beginning with an initial action in Paris, remain the most contested and most painful chapter of her legacy, one that historians have argued about for centuries. The degree to which Catherine was the architect of that moment, the degree to which she was responding to circumstances that had already spiraled beyond her control, the degree to which she made a catastrophically wrong decision under genuine fear for the safety of the monarchy. All of that is genuinely complicated, and I'm not going to flatten it into a simple verdict here. History rarely fits into simple verdicts, and Catherine de' Medici's history certainly does not. What I will say is this: she governed France in practice for the better part of 3 decades. She did it from a position that had no formal constitutional status. She did it in a culture that did not consider women appropriate holders of political authority. She did it while raising 10 children, managing the grief of watching most of them suffer or die young, navigating the hostility of the French nobility, and operating in the permanent shadow of a reputation she had not earned and could not fully escape. That is not villain. That is endurance. But Catherine de' Medici is only one chapter in a much longer story, and I want to make sure we do not spend so much time in France that we miss what was happening in other courts. Because across the world in the second half of the 19th century, one of the most remarkable exercises of royal power by any person of any gender was unfolding inside the Forbidden City in Beijing. Empress Daja Cixi, born in 1835, died in 1908, is one of the most misunderstood figures in modern history. Western accounts of the time painted her as a monster, cruel, manipulative, the embodiment of Chinese resistance to progress and reform. Later revisionist scholarship went perhaps too far in the other direction, presenting her as a proto-reformer, misrepresented by her enemies. The truth, as usual, is somewhere between those poles and considerably more interesting than either of them. Cixi entered the Forbidden City as a concubine to the Shanfang Emperor at the age of 16 in 1852. She was one of dozens of women in the imperial harem, selected through a formal court process that evaluated candidates on their appearance, their bearing, and their family background. There was no reason at that point to believe she would be anything other than one of many. But she had a son, and in 1861, when the Xianfeng Emperor died and her 5-year-old son became the Tongji Emperor, everything changed. In the power vacuum that followed the emperor's death, Cixi moved with a speed and decisiveness that surprised everyone who had underestimated her. She formed an alliance with the Empress Dowager Khan, the senior imperial consort, and together they effectively seized the regency, outmaneuvering a council of 8 regents that the dying emperor had appointed to govern in the child's name. The coup, and it was essentially a coup, however bloodless, was accomplished in a matter of weeks. Cixi would go on to exercise dominant influence over the Qing dynasty for almost half a century. Her son died young. She placed her nephew on the throne. He attempted to assert his own authority during the 100 Days Reform of 1898. She placed him under house arrest and resumed control. She was 73 years old, and she'd been navigating the most complex political environment in the world for nearly 40 years. I do not say any of this to celebrate every decision she made. Some of them were genuinely catastrophic, particularly her support for the Boxer movement in 1900, which led directly to the foreign intervention that humiliated China and accelerated the dynasty's eventual collapse. But I say it because the sheer scope of what she accomplished, from the starting position of a teenage concubine in a country that offered women essentially no formal political standing, deserves to be understood in its full dimensions. You might be wondering, and I think it is a fair question, what made it possible for these women to accumulate the power they did, given that the formal structures of the courts they operated in were so thoroughly designed around male authority? The answer, I think, lies in a gap that those formal structures consistently failed to close. The official machinery of court power, the councils, the ministers, the military commands, the formal titles, was almost entirely male. That was by design, and by law. But the unofficial machinery of court power, the access, the information, the personal relationships, the knowledge of who trusted whom and who resented whom, and who owed a favor to whom, that machinery was not gendered in the same way. It could not be because it operated precisely in the spaces between formal roles. In the private conversations that happened after the council meeting ended, in the letter that went by private courier rather than official post, in the bedroom, the nursery, the domestic spaces where the formal protocols of the court did not apply. Women had always been present in those spaces. In many cases, they ran them. And the women who understood that this informal machinery was where real power actually moved, as opposed to where it was officially supposed to move. Those women could build something formidable. Empress Doja Sixi understood it. Catherine de' Medici understood it. So did Eleanor of Aquitaine, who governed England as regent while her son Richard I was on crusade in the 1190s. So did Nur Jahan, the 20th wife of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who for a period in the early 17th century essentially governed the Mughal Empire while her husband's health deteriorated. So did Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VIII of England, whose patient decades of political maneuvering made the Tudor dynasty possible. Each of these women operated in a different culture, a different century, a different court. Each found a different path through, but each understood the same fundamental truth in a court defined by performance and hierarchy. The most durable power was the power that did not announce itself, that built quietly, that made itself indispensable before it made itself visible. There is one more figure I want to bring into this conversation, because she represents an aspect of female power in royal courts that is different from regency or political management, and in some ways more universal. Nur Jahan's story begins in a caravans in Kandahar in 1577, where she was born to a Persian noble family, making their way to seek employment at the Mughal court. Her father Gwasbeg would rise through the court hierarchy to become a senior minister. Her life trajectory was shaped from the beginning by the politics of patronage and access that defined court life everywhere. She married a courtier as a young woman, had a daughter, was widowed. She was 34 when Emperor Jahangir saw her at a court festival in 1611, and in a departure from the typical imperial preference for young brides, decided he wanted to marry her. What followed over the next 2 decades was one of the more remarkable partnerships in the history of royal courts. Jahangir was a man of genuine aesthetic sensitivity and significant personal vulnerabilities. He struggled with substance dependency throughout his adult life, a condition that contemporaries documented and that became increasingly incapacitating as he aged. As his capacity for active governance diminished, Nur Jahan's capacity expanded to fill the space. She issued imperial orders under her own name. Her name appeared on official imperial farmans, the formal decrees that carried the force of law. Coins were struck bearing her image alongside Jahangir's, an extraordinary honor with few precedents in Mughal history. She managed her father's ministry, her brother's career, the diplomatic relationships with Persia and Central Asia. She hunted accounts describe her as an exceptional markswoman, and she conducted herself in the public ceremonial life of the court with a visibility that defied the pura conventions of the time. She also designed buildings and gardens, developed new styles in textile and jewelry design that influenced Mughal artistic production for decades, and by multiple contemporary accounts, was simply one of the most intelligent and capable people at one of the most sophisticated courts in the world. When Jahangir died in 1627, she retired from public life. She did not attempt to hold power after her patron was gone. She understood the difference between her own authority and the authority she had held in his name. She spent the remaining 18 years of her life building a mausoleum for her husband and writing poetry. She died at 63. I have always found something almost moving in that retirement. A woman who had held the effective governance of an empire in her hands, who understood power with extraordinary clarity, and who recognized with the same clarity when the particular configuration of circumstances that had made her power possible had ended. What ties all of these women together across such different cultures, such different centuries, such different specific circumstances, is something simpler and more human than political theory. They all paid attention to what everyone else was too busy performing to notice. In courts defined by visibility, by display, by the constant theater of power, there was always a set of eyes watching from the edges, watching who spoke to whom, watching which minister seemed anxious and which seemed confident, watching where the real conversations happened as opposed to the official ones, watching for the moment when the formal structure shifted and the informal one could move. That kind of watching is unglamorous. It does not appear in portraits. It does not generate the kind of dramatic records that battles and speeches and treaties generate, which is partly why these women have so often been written out of the histories of the courts they shaped. But the courts existed the way they did for as long as they did, partly because of what those watching eyes saw and what they preserved. We've been moving throughout this entire journey through the beautiful and the complex, and the sometimes dark dimensions of royal court life, the architecture, the rituals, the information networks, the children, the fools, the women. But there is one chapter we've been quietly avoiding, the one that deals with something that no amount of ceremony or political intelligence could ultimately prevent. The physical reality of living inside these places, the smell of them, the disease in them, the bodies in them aging, failing, dying, surrounded by all that gold. Because the truth about hygiene, illness, and death inside the great royal palaces of history is so far from the perfumed candle-lit image we carry in our heads that it almost reads like satire. Almost. Right. I promised you the smell, and I'm going to deliver on that promise. But I want to start somewhere that might surprise you, because the story of hygiene and disease in royal courts is not simply a story of people being filthy and ignorant. It is more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways more disturbing than that framing suggests. Here's the question I want you to hold in your mind as we go through this. How is it possible that the richest, most powerful people in the world, people with access to the finest materials, the most skilled craftsmen, the largest buildings ever constructed, lived in conditions that we would today consider genuinely shocking? The answer tells us something important, not just about the past, but about the relationship between wealth, power, and the basic infrastructure of human life. Because it turns out that having more resources does not automatically translate into better conditions. Sometimes it translates into bigger problems, with fancier decorations around them. Let us begin in Versailles, because Versailles is always where you end up. When you want a story that makes your jaw drop, the Palace of Versailles was, by virtually every measure available to the 17th century, a triumph of human organization and artistic achievement. 20,000 acres of landscaped grounds, a palace containing roughly 2,000 rooms, a permanent population of somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people, depending on the season and the occasion, gold leaf and mirror glass and painted ceilings and fountains that required an engineering project of extraordinary ambition to keep flowing. It also had a sanitation problem of almost comic proportions. The palace was not designed with adequate toilet facilities for the number of people living in it. This is not a subtle or contested historical point. It is thoroughly documented in contemporary accounts, memoirs, and the records of palace administrators who dealt with the consequences. The standard solution for most of the people living and working in Versailles was to use the corners of stairwells, the spaces behind tapestries, the less trafficked corridors, and the palace gardens. The gardens of Versailles, those magnificent, geometrically perfect gardens that appear in every travel brochure and art history textbook, were regularly used as open-air latrines by the thousands of people who inhabited the palace and had nowhere else to go. King Louis XIV issued multiple royal edicts during his reign, specifically instructing people not to relieve themselves in the corridors and stairwells of the palace. The fact that he had to issue these edicts more than once suggests they were not entirely effective. There were chamber pots, of course. There were close stools, essentially padded chairs with a container beneath them, which served as the private toilet facilities for the king and the highest-ranking members of the court. Louis XIV actually conducted business from his close stool, granted audiences, discussed affairs of state, received petitions while using it, which, when you think about the lever ceremony we discussed in our opening chapters, adds a dimension to the theater of royal power that the golden portraits do not quite capture. The royal bathing arrangements were also considerably less luxurious than the general aesthetic of the palace might suggest. Bathing was not a daily practice for most Europeans in the 17th century. Regardless of social class, there were complex and shifting cultural attitudes about the relationship between bathing and health. Some periods and some medical traditions actively discouraged frequent bathing, on the grounds that it opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to disease. The medical reasoning was wrong, but the concern was genuine. The result was that even in the wealthiest households in Europe, bathing might happen a handful of times a year at most for many people. Louis XIV himself was reportedly not a frequent bather. Contemporary accounts, always to be read with the awareness that court memoirs were frequently written with political agendas, suggest that his personal hygiene practices were largely limited to being rubbed down with spirits and having his linen changed frequently. Fresh linen was considered a substitute for washing. Change your shirt often enough, the thinking went, and your body would be clean enough. I want to be fair here. This was the dominant medical and cultural understanding of the time, shared across social classes. Louis was not uniquely negligent. He was following the accepted practices of his era, but it is a vivid reminder that our picture of Versailles gleaming, fragrant, magnificent is largely a retrospective construction. The reality smelled considerably more human. The disease that moved through royal courts was not a democratic leveler. In the simple sense, wealth and status did provide some protective advantages, primarily through better nutrition and better access to whatever medical care existed, but it also created specific vulnerabilities, and the record of royal mortality from infectious diseases sobering. Smallpox alone killed or permanently disfigured an extraordinary number of European monarchs and royal family members across the 17th and 18th centuries. Louis XIV survived smallpox in 1647. His son, the Grander Louis, died in 1711, almost certainly from smallpox. His grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, died in 1712 from measles, and his wife died within 6 days of him. Their son, the Duke of Brittany, died 6 weeks after that. In the space of a single year, 3 generations of the French royal succession were swept away. Louis XIV, then 72 years old, outlived them all. He died in 1715 from gangrene complications following a leg injury, an agonizing end that contemporary accounts describe in clinical detail, during which the king reportedly maintained a composure and dignity that impressed everyone who witnessed it. His death itself was surrounded by the same ceremonial apparatus that had organized every other moment of his life. The liver had always had its counterpart, the coochie, the formal ceremony of the king going to bed. And at the very end there was a final ceremony, the public death of the king observed by the court, accompanied by the last rites witnessed and recorded, and absorbed into the performance that had never really stopped. He was 76 years old. He had reigned for 72 years, the longest verified reign of any monarch in major European history. He had outlived his son, his grandson, and his great-grandson, the man who had been the Sun King, the embodiment of French imperial power, the architect of Versailles and the lever and the Hall of Mirrors, died in a bed surrounded by people watching him do it, just as people had watched him do everything else. There is something in that consistency, in the idea that even death was a performance, was required to be a performance, because the performance never ended, that I find genuinely haunting. The relationship between royal courts and epidemic disease takes a particularly dark turn when we look at the specific vulnerabilities that the physical concentration of a court created. Think about what a royal court was from an epidemiological standpoint. Thousands of people living in close proximity, many of them traveling regularly between the palace and other locations. Foreign capitals, country estates, armies, merchant centers, and then returning. Animals present in the kitchens, the stables, the hawking mews. Food stored and prepared under conditions that would have horrified a modern health inspector. Water sources shared by enormous numbers of people. A royal court was, in epidemiological terms, an ideal environment for the transmission of infectious disease. The same density and interconnectedness that made it a powerful political organism made it a dangerous biological one. The Ottoman court in Constantinople grappled with this with particular urgency because the empire's geographic position at the intersection of trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa made it a nexus for the movement of disease as well as goods. Plague struck Constantinople repeatedly throughout the Ottoman period. The court developed a practice during severe outbreaks of relocating the sultan and the most essential members of the household to one of the smaller palaces outside the city. An early form of what we would now call quarantine, though the biological reasoning behind it was not fully understood. The Chinese imperial court operated a version of the same logic. The Forbidden City itself was a somewhat controlled environment. Access was restricted. The population was defined and innumerable. The movement of outsiders was regulated. But the broader court that surrounded it, including the enormous bureaucratic apparatus of the Qing dynasty, was in constant contact with the rest of the empire. When epidemic disease moved through China, and it moved through China with terrible regularity, the court was not immune, despite the walls. Death at court was not only from disease. The physical environment of a palace, however magnificent, was also genuinely dangerous in ways that are easy to overlook. Fire was a constant threat. The combination of candles, thousands of them, required to illuminate the enormous spaces with wooden furniture, fabric hangings, paper documents, and human beings who were sometimes drinking heavily was a recipe for catastrophe. Several European palaces were significantly damaged or destroyed by fire during the period of their greatest splendor. The Palace of Whitehall in London, the largest palace in Europe at its height, considerably larger than Versailles, burned almost entirely to the ground in 1698, leaving only the banqueting house standing. An estimated 1,500 rooms were destroyed. The fire reportedly started when a servant left linen too close to a charcoal fire. 1 to 500 rooms gone because someone was careless with laundry. Falls were common in staircases that were often steep, poorly lit, and crowded with people carrying heavy loads. Hunting accidents took a steady toll. We mentioned Henry II of France dying in a jousting accident. But hunting injuries were a constant feature of court life, given how central hunting was to royal culture across virtually every tradition we have examined. The physical sports that formed the basis of aristocratic masculine identity, jousting, hunting falconry, swordsmanship, were genuinely dangerous, and the historical record of serious injuries among the nobility is extensive. The very medicines meant to heal were often dangerous in their own right. Mercury, arsenic, and antimony, all toxic substances featured in the pharmacopeias of royal court physicians across multiple cultures. Lead-based cosmetics were in widespread use among both men and women of the European courts. The white face paint that was fashionable throughout much of the 16th and 17th centuries and which appears in portrait after portrait, from Elizabeth I to the court ladies of Louis XIV, contained significant quantities of lead carbonate. The women who used it over many years absorbed measurable amounts of lead through their skin. The cumulative neurological and physical effects of chronic low-leveled exposure would have been real, even if no one at the time had the framework to identify them. Elizabeth I is believed by some medical historians to have had lead poisoning from her heavy cosmetic use later in her life. Whether or not that specific diagnosis holds up to scrutiny, it is a strange thought. One of the most intellectually formidable rulers in English history, possibly having her mental acuity gradually compromised by the beauty routine of her era. The palace was not just a stage. It was also in quiet and incremental ways a place where the body paid a price for its proximity to power. I want to offer a thought before we leave this chapter because I think the history of hygiene and disease at royal courts has a lesson in it that extends beyond the historical curiosity. We tend to look at the past and see its failures as the product of ignorance, of not knowing what we know, of not having the tools and understanding that we have. And that is partly true. People in the 17th century did not know about germ theory. They did not understand the transmission mechanisms of infectious disease. Their medical frameworks, however sophisticated they were, by the standards of their time, were built on fundamentally incorrect premises. But there is another dimension to the story that I think is worth sitting with. Many of the specific sanitation problems of Versailles, for instance, the inadequate toilet facilities, the use of corridors and gardens, were not the result of ignorance. They were the result of the palace being designed to be magnificent rather than functional. The priorities of its construction were display power and beauty. The practical needs of the thousands of human beings who would actually live in it were secondary. That is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of royal courts with striking consistency. The buildings built for display rather than habitation. The ceremonies designed for political effect rather than human comfort. The systems organized around the performance of power rather than the well-being of the people inside them. And the people inside them, the kings and queens and courtiers and servants who inhabited these extraordinary impossible spaces, paid the physical price of living inside a performance that never quite remembered they were mortal. The body in the end always has the final word. No ceremony, no architecture, no intelligence network. No amount of gold leaf can negotiate with smallpox or gangrene or the slow accumulation of lead in the bloodstream. The greatest courts in human history were also underneath everything, just buildings full of people with all the vulnerabilities that human beings carry everywhere they go. That mortality, that inescapability of the physical is the foundation on which the next part of our story rests. Because it was precisely when the gap between the court's performance of invincibility and the actual fragility of the people inside it became too large, too visible, too impossible to maintain that the whole extraordinary structure began to crack. Some of the most powerful royal courts in history did not decline slowly. They collapsed, suddenly, almost completely taking with them centuries of accumulated tradition and the lives of the people who had staked everything on the permanence of what they served. How that happened and why it happened in the particular ways it did is a story that starts with a bread riot in Paris and ends with a bonfire in the grounds of a Russian palace. It is the story of how royal courts fall, and we are heading there right now. On the 5th of October 1789, a crowd of several thousand women left the markets of Paris and walked 23 kilometers through the rain to Versailles. They were not tourists. They were not petitioners following the formal protocols of royal supplication. They were hungry, exhausted, and furious because bread in Paris had become so expensive that working families could no longer afford to eat. While the court at Versailles continued its ceremonial existence at an annual cost that a contemporary pamphlet estimated could have fed the population of an entire province. They arrived at the palace gates, pushed through them, and effectively occupied the building. The next morning, the royal family was escorted back to Paris, surrounded by that same crowd which had attached the heads of 2 palace guards to pikes and carried them at the front of the procession as a rather unambiguous statement of intent. Louis V, XVI, and Marianne Nguyen left Versailles on the 6th of October, 1789. They never returned. The palace that had taken decades to build, that had housed the full machinery of French royal power for over a century, that had been the deliberate, calculated embodiment of everything we've been discussing in this entire journey. The architecture of power, the ceremonies, the surveillance, the performance of invincibility was abandoned in a morning. And that, I think, is where this chapter has to begin. Not with theory, but with that image. Women walking through rain to take back what the court had spent a century forgetting it had taken from them. The fall of a royal court is almost never a single event. What looks like a sudden collapse from the outside is almost always the visible eruption of pressures that have been building for years, sometimes decades, sometimes generations. The bread riot in Paris that sent the women of the markets to Versailles was the surface expression of a financial crisis that had been developing since at least the reign of Louis XIV since. In fact, the very years when the palace was at its most magnificent. The cost of Versailles, the cost of France's wars, the cost of maintaining the elaborate court structure that we have been exploring throughout this video, all of it had been accumulating on the books of the French state for over 100 years. By the time Louis V, XVI inherited the throne in 1774, France was spending roughly half its annual revenue on debt service alone. Half. Just paying the interest on what previous kings had borrowed to maintain the spectacle. The reforms needed to address this were obvious to the financial ministers who served Louis. They proposed variations of the same solution repeatedly: tax the nobility. The French aristocracy, who had managed through a combination of historical privilege and political resistance to exempt themselves from most direct taxation, were sitting on wealth that, if taxed even modestly, could have stabilized the royal finances. But to tax the nobility, the king needed the cooperation of the nobility. And the nobility, those same men and women who had spent generations competing for the privilege of handing Louis XIV his shirt, who had built their entire social identity around their proximity to the crown, were not inclined to cooperate in a reform that would reduce their advantages. The court, in other words, had created the very aristocratic culture that now made it impossible to govern. The system of privilege and access and ceremonial importance that kept the nobility tied to Versailles had also made them into a class that was politically untouchable. The king could not reform the system because the system had made the king dependent on the people who benefited from it. It is one of the more elegant examples of institutional self-destruction in recorded history, and it should sound familiar to anyone who has ever watched an organization become so committed to maintaining its own structure that it loses the ability to change in response to the world around it. The pattern that brought down the French monarchy, excess, disconnection, inability to reform, appears with remarkable consistency across the other great royal court collapses of the modern era. But each instance has its own specific texture, its own particular combination of internal rot and external shock. And I think it is worth looking at least 2 more before we try to draw any larger conclusions. The Romanov court in Russia offers a case study in institutional collapse that is in some ways even more dramatic than the French Revolution, precisely because the speed of the final disintegration was so extraordinary. The Roman dynasty had ruled Russia since 1613. By the early 20th century, under Tsar Nicholas II, it presided over the largest country in the world by land area, an empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing hundreds of ethnic groups and dozens of languages. It was on paper one of the most powerful political entities on Earth. The court that surrounded Nicholas was, by the accounts of virtually everyone who observed it closely, profoundly, almost willfully disconnected from the realities of the country it governed. The ceremonial life of the Russian imperial court, the elaborate balls, the religious ceremonies, the rigid hierarchy of ranks and orders and precedences, continued with extraordinary fidelity to tradition, even as the country outside the palace walls was changing at a pace that the court seemed incapable of registering. Nicholas himself was not a stupid man. He was by most accounts a decent and genuinely loving father, a man of personal piety and private kindness. But he'd been formed by a court culture that had over generations become increasingly sealed off from the information it needed to govern well. The people who reached him were largely the people the court system had selected for proximity, people who had succeeded within the court's own logic, which was not the same logic as the world outside the disasters accumulated. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, a humiliating defeat that shocked a nation accustomed to thinking of itself as a great power. The events of Bloody Sunday in January of 1905, when troops fired on a peaceful procession of workers and their families approaching the Winter Palace with a petition for the Tsar killing and wounding hundreds. The grinding catastrophe of the First World War, which by 1916 had produced Russian military casualties, estimated at somewhere between 1.6 and 1.88 million dead, with millions more wounded and taken prisoner. Through all of this, the ceremonial life of the court continued. Nicholas maintained his diary with the orderly precision of a man who'd been taught from childhood that the performance of normality was itself a form of governance. On days when the fate of the empire hung in the balance, his diary entries record the weather walks and the garden meals, family conversations. Not because he was indifferent. The letters between Nicholas and his wife Alexandra reveal a man in genuine anguish, but because the court had never given him any other way to be. In February of 1917, the dynasty collapsed with a speed that astonished even the people who had been predicting it. Nicholas abdicated on the 15th of March 1917. In July of 1918, he and his family were shot in a cellar in Yekaterinburg. 304 years of Romanov rule, 3 centuries of imperial court culture of elaborate ceremony and dynastic pageantry ended in abasement. The Ottoman court offers a third variation on the theme, and one that I find particularly interesting because its collapse was so much more gradual and so much more self-aware. The Ottoman Empire at its height in the 16th century under Suleiman I, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, was the most powerful political entity in the Western world, arguably in the entire world. The court at Topkapi Palace that we visited in our second chapter was at that moment the administrative center of an empire that stretched from Algeria to Baghdad, from Hungary to Yemen. It had outlasted the Byzantine Empire, absorbed the Arab Caliphate, and was actively threatening the gates of Vienna. By the late 19th century, it was being called the sick man of Europe, a phrase attributed to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who used it in a diplomatic conversation in 1853. The contrast between those two moments, separated by roughly 3 centuries, is a measure of how thoroughly the Ottoman court had lost its adaptive capacity. The court had not become less elaborate. If anything, the ceremonial apparatus of the late Ottoman court was in some ways more complex, more ritualized, more insistent on maintaining the forms of imperial grandeur than it had ever been. But the substance had drained away. The sultans of the late Ottoman period were, with a few exceptions, men formed by the same isolated, overmanaged palace environment that had shaped their predecessors, educated in the inner chambers of Topkapi, surrounded by people whose interests were tied to maintaining the status quo, insulated from the kind of direct engagement with political reality that might have enabled effective reform. There were reformers, and there were genuine reform efforts. The Tanzit period of the 1840s through the 1870s produced a series of significant modernizing reforms, some of which were genuinely substantial. But the court culture resisted reform not through active opposition, so much as through the passive weight of its own accumulated traditions. Each reform had to fight against 1,000 years of established practice, established privilege, established ways of doing things that the people who benefited from them defended not because they were ideologically committed to them, but simply because they were familiar. The empire was formally dissolved in 1922. The Sultanate was abolished. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, left Constantinople on a British warship in November of 1922. He was not escorted by a procession of courtiers. He left quietly in the middle of the night, taking only what he could carry. The court that had organized the daily life of one of the most powerful empires in human history for nearly 5 centuries vanished, essentially overnight. So what is the pattern? What can we actually learn from watching 3 of the greatest royal court systems in history collapse within roughly a century and a half of each other? I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I want to offer a view that I think is more useful than the simple one. More useful than power corrupts, or the rich always fall, or any of the other easy conclusions that the surface of these stories might suggest. The common thread, as I see it, is not excess. Excess is a symptom, not a cause. It is not cruelty, though cruelty was present in all of these systems. It is not even incompetence, though incompetent decisions were certainly made. The common thread is the failure of feedback. Every system, every organization, every human institution requires some mechanism for receiving accurate information about the gap between how it believes things are and how things actually are. Without that mechanism, the gap widens invisibly. Decisions get made on the basis of an increasingly fictional understanding of reality. Problems that could have been addressed while small become large and then become catastrophic, and then become irreversible. Royal courts, almost by structural necessity, were terrible at feedback. We have spent this entire video documenting exactly why the surveillance apparatus that watched everyone. It also filtered information before it reached the king. The ceremonies that organized daily life. They also consumed the time and attention that might have gone toward governance. The hierarchy of access that determined who could reach the monarch. It also ensured that the people who reached him were largely the people who had succeeded within the court's own logic, which was not always the same as the people who had the most accurate picture of the world outside. And the gestures, the one designated mechanism for honest feedback, were allowed to speak only within the framing of comedy, only when the king was in the mood to hear it, only up to the line that the king's goodwill defined. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. There is a moment I keep returning to near the end of the French monarchy that captures the whole problem in miniature. In 1788, the year before the Revolution, Louis XVI was briefed by his ministers on the state of the royal finances. The situation was by any objective measure desperate. The treasurer Nessa had published a public account of royal finances, the Compare, that showed a surplus because Nessa had omitted the wartime extraordinary expenditures that were in fact producing a massive deficit. The published document was reassuring. The actual situation was not. When Louis finally understood the full picture, when the fiction of solvency was no longer maintainable, he reportedly said that it was a situation he could not have imagined. That sentence, that admission, that is the sound of a court system that has failed at its most basic function. A king who could not imagine the financial reality of his own kingdom, not because he was stupid, but because the system surrounding him had been designed generation after generation to produce a particular performance rather than a functional government. He could not have imagined it. And the women of the Paris markets walking through October rain with empty bread baskets could imagine very little else. The courts fell. The buildings remained, some of them. Versailles is a museum. Topkapi is a museum. The Forbidden City is a museum. The Winter Palace is a museum. You can walk through them today and feel the echo of what they were, the scale of them, the beauty of them, the sheer audacity of what human beings built when they had the resources of empires and the ambition to match. What happened to all of that? To the ideas, the rituals, the systems, the ways of organizing power and space and human behavior that royal courts spent centuries developing did not disappear when the courts themselves collapsed. It went somewhere. It transformed, adapted, found new forms and new contexts, survived in ways that most people never notice because the connection is not obvious until you look for it. And when you see it, when you start to recognize the DNA of the royal court in the places it has ended up, the world looks genuinely different. That is exactly what we're going to explore in our final chapter. Where did the royal court go? The answer, I think, is going to surprise you. So, the courts fell. The palaces became museums. The dynasties became history. The elaborate systems of ceremony and surveillance and access and performance that had organized the lives of millions of people for centuries were officially over. And yet, I want you to do something for me right now. Just a small thought experiment before we go any further. Think about the last time you walked into a very important meeting, maybe a job interview, maybe a presentation to senior leadership, maybe a meeting with someone who had the power to make a decision that mattered to your life. Did you think about what to wear? Did you think about where you would sit and whether you should sit or wait to be invited to sit? Did you think about how you would enter the room and whether to speak first or wait? Did you think about who in the room was aligned with you and who might not be and how to navigate that geography without showing that you were thinking about it? Of course you did. We all do. It is so automatic that we barely notice it anymore. But here is what I want you to consider. Every single one of those instincts, the clothing, the spatial positioning, the management of access and proximity and information in a hierarchical environment. Those are the direct descendants of 500 years of royal court culture. The royal court did not disappear. It dissolved into the water supply. It became the operating system underneath modern institutional life. And once you see it, you genuinely cannot unsee it. Let us start with the most visible example because it is also the one that most people actively resist connecting to its origins. The modern corporate headquarters. Think about the physical design of a serious corporate campus, the kind built by major technology companies or financial institutions over the past 30 years. The vast open reception areas designed to make you feel small and therefore impressed. The careful management of which elevators go to which floors so that certain levels of the building are physically inaccessible to most employees. The executive floor separated from the rest of the building, not just by height, but by a different quality of materials, a different density of space, a different quality of silence. The assistant who manages the calendar of the senior executive, who in practice manages access to the senior executive, occupying a position of influence that bears almost no relationship to their formal job title. That is the graduated access system of Versailles, wearing a lanyard and operating a coffee machine. The chief executive who holds walking meetings that subordinates compete to attend because the meeting itself is less important than the access it represents. The open plan office that makes everyone visible to everyone else at all times. The culture of visible dedication of being seen to arrive early and leave late. The performance of commitment and loyalty in contexts where the actual work could be measured in other ways. All of it traces directly back to the logic of the royal court. Power is demonstrated through visibility, reinforced through access, maintained through the management of information, and expressed through the architecture of the space in which it operates. The CEOs of major corporations do not think of themselves as heirs to Louis XIV's political philosophy, but the playbook they operate from is older than they know. The modern political state is perhaps an even cleaner example because the continuity is more explicit. The The White House is not just a building where the President of the United States lives and works. It is a carefully managed ceremonial environment in which every aspect of physical space communicates hierarchy and power. The Oval Office, its shape, its proportions, its famous resolute desk has been deliberately staged and restaged by every administration since Franklin Roosevelt to project a specific image of presidential authority. The placement of chairs, the distance between them, the presence or absence of a fireplace in the background of official photographs, all of this is thought about, managed, and occasionally agonized over by teams of people whose job is exactly that. The state dinner at the White House, the formal dinner given in honor of a foreign head of state, is the direct successor of the grand diplomatic banquets of the European royal courts. The seating arrangement is politically significant. Who sits where, relative to the president, communicates something about the relationship between the two countries. Who is invited and who is not invited is reported and analyzed by diplomatic observers around the world. The food, the table settings, the entertainment, all of it is chosen to communicate American values, American wealth, American cultural confidence. The assay system is gone, but everything else is essentially intact. Even the press corps, the journalists who cover the president daily, who travel with them, who are given access to the briefing room and denied access to the private quarters, operates according to a logic that would have been immediately recognizable to any 17th century courtier. Proximity equals access. Access equals information. Information equals influence. The journalists who maintain the best relationships with the administration get the best stories. The administration manages those relationships carefully, feeding information through trusted channels and withholding it from those who have fallen out of favor. Francis Walsingham would have understood every element of this arrangement instantly. He would simply have called it statecraft. Hollywood deserves its own moment here because it is the most culturally visible example of court dynamics operating in a contemporary context, and because the people inside it tend to be, in my observation, either deeply aware of this and comfortable with it, or genuinely surprised when you point it out. The studio system, at its height in the 1930s and 1940s, the era of the major studios and their contract players, their controlled publicity, their management of which stars appeared together and which photographs and which relationships were publicly acknowledged, was so closely analogous to a royal court that the parallels are almost comical. The studio head as sovereign, the A-list actors as the high nobility, competing for the best projects and the best press, the agents and managers as the courtiers managing access in both directions, the publicists as the information managers controlling the narrative with the same care that Richelieu's agents manage diplomatic correspondence. The modern entertainment industry has changed in its specifics, but not in its underlying logic. The awards seasons, the Golden Globes, the Screen Actors Guild Awards, the Academy Awards function as an elaborate ceremonial calendar, not unlike the feast days and formal occasions that organize the social year of a European royal court. Everyone knows who is in favor and who is not based on who appears on which lists, who is invited to which events, who is seated where and photographed with whom. The red carpet is the hall of mirrors. The after party is the grand co. The seating chart at the Vanity Fair Oscar party is, I promise you, taken seriously by the people who compose it in a way that would not have seemed out of place at Versailles. There is a more intimate dimension to the court's legacy that I want to address before we close because I think it is the most personally relevant. The dynamics of royal court culture did not only survive in grand institutional structures, they survived in the way that human beings behave in any hierarchical group in offices, in social circles, in families with strong dominant figures, in any context where some people have more power than others, and where that power is not fully formalized or transparent. The person at the dinner party who monitors the host's mood and subtly shifts the conversation away from topics that might produce tension. That is a courtier's skill refined over centuries of exactly that practice. The employee who understands which information to share with which colleague and which to keep close, that is intelligence management translated into a modern professional context. The friend group that has a clear center of gravity. One person whose approval everyone seeks around, whose preferences the social arrangements quietly organize themselves. That is a court scaled down. These patterns are not necessarily bad. They are deeply human. We are social animals operating in hierarchies, and the skills of navigating those hierarchies are genuinely valuable. What the history of royal courts adds to this observation is a kind of long perspective on what happens when those patterns run unchecked, when the feedback mechanisms fail, when the performance of the court becomes more important than its actual function. The lesson is not that hierarchy is wrong. The lesson is that hierarchy without honest feedback, without the equivalent of a jester who can speak freely without some mechanism for the truth to reach the center of power, hierarchy tends over time toward catastrophic disconnection from reality. We saw that pattern collapse entire empires. The same pattern operates at smaller scales every day. The palaces themselves are the final piece of this legacy that I want to consider, because what happened to them after the courts fell is itself a kind of coda to everything we have discussed. Versailles was opened to the public in 1837 by King Louis Philippe, who converted it into a museum dedicated to what he called all the glories of France. The decision was partly pragmatic. A revolutionary France could not simply maintain a palace as a palace without the obvious political contradictions, and partly brilliant. By turning Versailles into a museum of national glory, Louis Philippe performed a very elegant piece of political jiu-jitsu. He acknowledged that the old monarchy was over while claiming its grandeur as the inheritance of the French nation. The Forbidden City was converted into the Palace Museum in 1925. 2 years after the last Qing emperor, the young Puyi, was formally expelled from the private quarters, where he'd been allowed to remain after his abdication. Topkapi was converted into a museum in 1924, the year after the Turkish Republic was formally proclaimed. The Winter Palace became the Hermitage, one of the great art museums of the world. In each case, the transformation from working court to public museum was the final act in the same story. The courts accumulated treasures, the art, the architecture, the objects of extraordinary beauty and historical significance that had been produced or collected by the dynasties over centuries, were transferred from the private possession of royalty to the public possession of the nation. The power that had commissioned all of that beauty was gone, but the beauty remained available now to everyone, in a way that would have been literally unimaginable to the kings and emperors who built it. There is something genuinely moving in that the Hall of Mirrors, which was built to overwhelm foreign ambassadors with French imperial power, now overwhelms tourists from Des Moines and Seoul and Mumbai, with something rather different, with a sense of what human beings are capable of when they have enormous resources and a vision, however flawed and self-serving, of what grandeur should look like. The court is gone. The beauty it made is for all of us now. We have traveled a long way together in this video. We started in the gilded cage, that central paradox of the royal court, where the most powerful people in the world were also in very real ways the least free. We walk through the architecture of power, through the morning rituals and the royal table, through the invisible networks of spies and the politics of the royal bedroom, through the lives of royal children and the wisdom of jesters, through the extraordinary women who held things together from the shadows, through disease and death and the slow accumulation of pressures that eventually brought the whole magnificent structure down. And now, here at the end, I find myself thinking about what I always think about when I spend a long time with this history. These courts were built by people who believed they were building something permanent, something that would last forever, or as close to forever as human ambition can imagine. The Sun King did not build Versailles thinking it would become a tourist destination. The Qing emperors did not design the Forbidden City imagining that school children would one day eat ice cream in the courtyards. They built for eternity. They got a few centuries and the things that outlasted them. The beauty, the art, the intellectual traditions, the hard-won understanding of how power actually works and how it actually fails. Those things belong to all of us. That, I think, is the most honest and most hopeful thing that can be said about the private world of royal courts. They were flawed, often cruel, frequently absurd. They were also capable of extraordinary beauty, extraordinary sophistication, and insights about human nature that remain as true today as they were when the candles first lit the Hall of Mirrors. We are their inheritors, all of us, whether we know it or not. If you have been with me through all 12 chapters of this journey, I want to say genuinely thank you. Thank you for your patience with the longer passages. Thank you for staying through the parts that were perhaps less immediately dramatic than others. Thank you for caring enough about history to spend this kind of time with it. Stories like these, the private stories, the behind-the-scenes stories, the ones that do not appear in the official portraits or the heroic accounts, those are the stories that I think matter most because they show us not just what people did, but how they actually lived. And how they actually lived tells us something essential about how we actually live now. The royal court is over, but we are still, in all the ways that matter, navigating its corridors. If this kind of history speaks to you, if you found yourself genuinely surprised, or moved, or reconsidering something you thought you knew, then you are exactly the kind of person I make these for. There are more stories waiting, more private worlds to open up, more corridors behind the gilded doors that history has not yet fully explored. Stay with us. The next one is going to be worth it.